the committees in order and
Start the pledge of allegiance.
make him in charge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Sounds like a good thing. So, that's it.
That was such a weird email thing.
Yeah, I don't know. So, yeah, I didn't understand what
The first item is the request for use of village property adjacent to 172 Mountain Road. I don't know if you guys want to come up and join us.
Yep.
Good evening.
How are you guys?
She's upstairs, so.
Yeah, so let's switch. You want to be yourself? Like being the all right, I need space here to put something out.
So they have reduced versions of it, but actually I could probably read that here too. But anyway, that's.
So this is an extra copy of the agenda.
I'm Stephen, I'm the engineer for Mr. Marinas.
In Marinas. I was born and raised actually in Irvington. My wife and I moved back to town. We were in Riverdale for a few years and bought a house from my parents, who bought the house from the original owners back in the 90s. So the house was built in the 50s. There was a retaining wall that was sort of falling apart. And then, you know, two young kids, and we decided to make some improvements. And in doing so, the boulders that were supporting the wall sort of are on the nature preserve property. Not the wall itself, but the supporting rocks. So.
Correct, there was a stone wall and the contractor moved it over slightly. And the wall itself, you can see in the photo, is roughly on the order of 3 foot high. That is not on the property line because we just did a brand new survey. What is on the property line, you can see from the section, is the base stone foundation which supports the wall. And you can see that roughly in the photo in the corner. In the upper corner.
Falling. Okay. Okay, so the wall is above the ground?
This
Yeah.
is the wall. This is the top side of the wall looking in the driveway.
Okay.
And this is a photo from the bottom side of the wall looking this way.
And the rocks are on the nature preserve,
Correct, by 2 feet.
by 2 feet?
Yes.
Okay.
That is, so just to set this up, this is
Mountain Road is at the top of the drawing.
So it's past it. Right past it.
just past it, closer to the sawmill?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
But they're underground at the nature preserve farm.
They're not underground, they're above ground.
Yes.
Okay, I was looking at the
If you
drawing.
look at the top corner picture.
Yeah, because of the way the grade falls off.
Correct.
And there was a big bedrock there, which the contractor said would be a good base for the wall itself, and the rocks sort of
Where is over here?
hang a little over it. So,
You can see it from the section where
This is,
the dark line is the property line.
Gotcha.
Okay, so if you continue that line straight down, you can see that the large stones extend past the property line. And the new surveyor says it's approximately 2 feet.
So the retaining wall was rebuilt,
Yes.
it was falling apart.
but it was in the same location because normally you would have had to get gotten variance for a retaining wall, right against the property line,
Not on a
No,
replacement.
not with it, yeah.
not on a replacement.
So it's where it was,
Correct.
so it's always been 2 feet over the.
My guess-
Falling down rocks are over it, but not that wall.
Again, the contractor came in and put, or rearranged all these massive stones so you'd have a solid foundation. Unfortunately, we didn't have the property line staked out.
There's a big cliff there to begin with, as you can see.
So what are you asking us to do?
But didn't you have to come in for a building permit?
We are in the process of the building permit, but the building permit,
But you didn't get the building permit before you did it, you're doing it now.
the contractor didn't get it. Okay, so that's why
That's
I
why
started the
you
process of
decided.
getting the building permit, and speaking with the building inspector, because he saw it went over the property line, he referred us to the board.
Right. So when he came out, was there,
No, he asked for a new survey.
no, but how did this come up? Was there like a stop work order?
Correct.
Right, so,
All you're trying to do is build a wall.
But the purpose of the survey is to determine where the wall was. Once the building inspector saw that parts of it were on village property, he can't proceed with it until you either say it's okay or don't say it's okay. I mean, that's the question I think they're about to ask you.
But if I'm missing unless I'm missing something, this is about a 60-foot run that's on,
What's on the village property or the nature center property is approximately about 40 feet.
okay, because I'm looking at 1 inches 30. It looks like it's more than an inch and a third.
Where it starts
Unless
to
this is scaled.
Where it starts to curve, it no longer is on village property. It's just that straight wall. If you see the section mark, where it says section 1,
Yeah.
from there to where it turns on a right angle. That's the section.
Right.
And that's about 40 feet. I can give you an exact dimension if you want it.
So this site plan has been scaled from the original drawing? That's what I'm trying to ask.
It's probably been scaled down so it could fit on a sheet.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering, because now it's, okay, so, because I would have read that as almost 60 feet if it hadn't been, if it had been not scaled.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
And here it reads at about 20 feet. So
And that's why it's always good to have a sense of the scale of it. Okay. So you said about 40 feet.
Correct.
And so what's right down here? This is just kind of empty?
This slopes down. This is the nature preserve. This is all wooded area.
You're trying to picture
That
that
little
landmark.
gully in between, it's almost like a ravine sort of, where I think they did put some sort of wooden, I guess, trails through the, yeah, bridges.
Bridges in there.
But,
Probably,
and there's a black fence somewhere down there too.
The actual nature center building is like right here, in respect to my drawing, right where the water bottle is.
So there is a trail that goes, one of the nature walking trails? No,
No.
it doesn't come near.
No, not even
The
close.
walking trail is.
It's wet.
So there's a little, I've been over the little bridge that they built that looks over the wetlands.
Yeah,
Is that
that's
inside
further
of
down.
your,
No, you can't even see it.
you can't even see that from your house?
Not with the, when, you know, the trees are, and the reeds
You
are
can see
up.
it
so-
from winter view.
So did was the building inspector, now that you've gotten to this point, was there any engineering concern about the way the foundation of the wall was?
I'm the engineer. I'm not concerned about the way the wall is constructed at all. And my client's willing to sign a stipulation that he'd be responsible for repairing or maintaining the wall.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just, because sometimes loose, I know these things are large, but.
Right. In these situations, these are very large boulders which make the base of the foundation of the wall. And the upper wall is all in cement, if you can see.
Yeah, they're not so concerned about that as much as things
Right.
shifting.
Again.
The lower, the base foundation slipping.
Right.
So these are actually, is this more like, you said the wall was built on,
It's a rock ledge.
Yeah.
The whole, it's the mountain.
so this here, is this more like, just to prevent erosion? These stones along the.
What kind of rubble of,
Are they acting
We
as?
actually did overkill
Yeah.
on the sides of the foundation for the wall. So it acts as, there's a difference in grade and it's about 6 feet.
Yeah.
And that's with those large stones. It's actually a base of the wall, but the large stones acts as a retaining wall for his driveway up above.
so what you see here are not the large stones. This
These
is
are
kind
the
of
large
rubble.
stones.
These are the large.
Yeah, these are the large stones.
So if there's no danger to possible park walkers, though there's not even a trail now, so I wouldn't expect that they'd be walking in that area, but they could. It's our parkland, it's
They're-
nature center, right, so there could be somebody walking.
But it's on the top side of the slope.
Yeah, right, so if they were walking in that little ravine, is it a danger to them? I guess.
Well, that's
it's
what I'm
risky
getting
for
at,
most,
is whether or not any of the boulders could be
Right,
jostled, but I without That's why I said, was the building
Again,
inspector happy or not?
Physically,
Yeah.
I couldn't go move a boulder, one of the ones on the bottom. The minimum weight of one of them is about 150 to 200 pounds.
I mean, yeah, they look like they're looser ones higher up, but anyways, that's why I was just wondering if the inspector or the village engineer had signed off on it or not.
Again, we didn't get to the point of going through the building permit process.
Yeah.
Before he goes there, he wants to know if where it's located is acceptable.
You may still have to make adjustments anyways.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So, I mean, what are potential remedies, Mary Ann?
I mean, if you're disposed to, letting it be there, you could do a license agreement, and part of the license agreement would be that, they have to insure the village, for anything that happens because of that wall being there. And I would think that would be the main provision. I would think probably it would have to be a revocable license agreement. If for any reason there was an issue, you can make them take it away, but I mean, probably not going to. And if you have the license agreement, it would define, actually put on paper that the part of the wall is on their property. I mean, on the village's property, but it's their wall and they'll be responsible for it and stuff. I mean, that's one way to do it. I mean, another way would be to sound the property, but that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, it seems a lot harder than that.
2 feet rocks.
Yeah.
I think the license, it's similar to what we did with, along the side street off of Main where they wanted a side entrance. Well, even the main entrance needed to have an agreement about use of village property. But that's revocable too, right? That one was,
Yeah.
That's kind of how it leads. I would like to look at the site quickly to make sure, I understand exactly what, I think I have a pretty good idea.
I think it really would have to be revocable, otherwise you'd be giving away parkland, and then that's another big whole issue, so the license.
Yeah, well, I have no desire to make a bigger deal out of this than, because if we didn't make some agreement, what would you have to do? You'd have to move all those rocks? Yes,
Unfortunately.
yes, right, that seems a little overkill. Doesn't seem like a reasonable, given the lack of a major problem happening, so I'd be agreeable to the kind of, arrangement you're talking about.
And then a license agreement can be for nothing or for money, or, that should call at a minimum. I would think that, the person who wants the license agreement would have to pay any of the, legal costs and drafting it and bringing it before.
Yeah, that would have been my recommendation, at a minimum, but which, it's not all that extensive for what it's
No,
worth. I mean, we've been through it before,
Not that
you've
they
seen
could
this.
go out and hire some counsel.
Yeah, you've seen these things before. So.
Yeah, and don't need title insurance and stuff.
That sounds like.
That sounds fine to me.
Would that be okay with you?
Yes.
I mean, that's probably the best we can do
Yes,
for you.
that's-
Well, that's the best you guys for us.
And then moving, yes.
That's a very good deal.
And I guess the contractor will know to always wait for a building permit.
The only question I have is, and I haven't walked it, and I'm probably not going to go out of my way to walk it at this point, since I see where you're going with this. But the only question I have is, from the village parkland and the trails particularly, is this highly visible or not? And if so, there may be some evergreen screening that would be appropriate, but probably fairly
I
minimal.
guess I want to go up and see where it is.
That's the only, again, I'm not talking about planting a forest, I'm just saying, if you have this looming wall that's over an area where people frequent, it would make sense to have some sort of screening, but.
But I have two caveats just to throw in. One is, wasn't the wall already there? But the second
How
one
much of
is
the wall was there?
on a slope.
It's gonna be hard, isn't it?
It's one of the most difficult things you can do to maintain a
Well,
separation.
I think if, again, if you guys want to, feel free to come out there and take a look at it,
Yeah.
at the site.
I mean, you have the advantage of being there already.
Right.
You know, it's,
We don't have to try to use our mind's eye.
Yeah.
And
Well, it's up to them.
should the Trails Committee look at it? No?
I think Larry and I here,
Oh, Larry.
Mark would love to walk up there. I bet Larry would love to.
I just stopped by tomorrow morning.
There. I was just thinking, being a parks guy.
My sense is, what was the state before the rebuild? Was the wall totally collapsed, partially collapsed? Was it
It
even?
was like 3/4 of the way collapsing. The water was starting to get through it, and it was just coming apart at the bottom.
But was it still at the 3.5-foot height?
Yeah, it was the same height. The base was starting to go, and
So I'm just wondering about what the visual change is.
it actually looks a lot better now than it used to. The guy that built the house originally, I guess he used like bed frames as like yeah,
Like garbage.
as a retaining, like it was a part of the retaining wall. So
So if you were standing in the wetlands looking over.
Okay.
So it sounds like we're all pretty much
Yeah.
in agreement here.
It's just a question of,
Welcome
if there's any reason to have screening, which probably won't be the case. Larry will take a
I'll look
look.
at it tomorrow morning, I'll
Yeah,
send you guys an email.
Yeah, and send me an email, and I'll draft a license agreement, and that could always be, I could draft it anyway, and that could always be added as a condition.
Sure.
We'll put it in your driveway.
it's fine.
Do you want it?
Yeah.
Sure.
Does anybody want? I have a full size if you want.
I'm gonna take it so I can look
Thank you guys. Thank you guys.
Bye.
Bye.
No, cheap food, I just want to be able to see it from, get a view from the
We're
other
having a big reception at the nature center. What is that on the?
It's Saturday, but
Yeah,
it's
right.
supposed to rain, so I don't know what's gonna.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, teeming rain.
side. Right.
So we go to wayfinding.
Yeah, we have to, we can't do this until 8, even though you're here.
Yeah, let's do wayfinding next.
Beaver screen.
So, yeah, when you last left us, you asked for signs in green as well as blue. So the first 2 pages are the original, the blue original, and the next 2 pages are the revised green signs. There's that.
Was that full green?
Well, apparently it's not, so.
And then this is the actual.
The green that they, if you remember, did you see, maybe you didn't see the intermediate emails, the green was almost neon green, that got put on the paper.
Yes, I love the design, I agree with the green. Oh, we have choices of green?
No,
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 these
no.
are the 2. This is just what it is. This is what,
The last page is just the palette of each.
Oh, I-
Each one.
this is the,
One side.
this is the OCA thing, but this is the OCA.
Perfect posture.
Right, leaning from the hips.
Yeah, she must be a yoga instructor.
Well, this is the,
No,
these are the
it's
signs,
just
those
like
are the park signs.
you go in to paint something white,
I wouldn't have called this.
95 shades.
Those are the OCA things. That's
So-
this.
So I believe the last conversation that you had about this was the notion of putting it out for a survey to the community, but you may not want to if you all sit here and agree. But that was suggested at the last time, so that's why we have them both presenting here. So if you have a desire to do it that way,
You can do a survey monthly.
whatever, yeah, I'm sure you can figure something out. Or if you don't want to do it that way and you just want to knock your head about a particular one and come up with a straw poll, that would be great, however you want to do.
Okay, I'm gonna vote for the blue, because I, was all in on this process, and Katie Paul, coming out of looking at the blues in the Tiffany room and thinking about the river. And then I actually found this is Home Place, this is the street signs that were the last go-around of the street signs, or this blue?
It's black.
Mine is black.
No, that's not,
No,
no,
I can see
there,
it.
sorry,
Oh,
it's
now
blue.
I can say yes.
So, I thought it harkens back a little bit, and, no, I
Is
think
that a
that,
picture of, I'm sorry?
that's the street signs that were the last go-around. Right now, if you look at most of our street signs, they're green. But that was left over from the former version, which is a little more retro.
So are we gonna
And,
change all of our street signs back to blue?
Eventually.
well, I mean,
No.
all of this is,
This is only for the downtown.
this is, yeah, and this is right at the edge of the, so,
Hysterical district.
but, I mean, I suppose if money were no object, you could do the whole thing over the next 10 years.
It's an object.
Obviously, that.
Don't worry, it's an object. That's our capital budget discussion.
Right. But I thought the evolution of the discussion, back and forth with the professional, this was the one we came up with in our more detailed discussion. I understand that the school is very connected to green.
I have a feeling if we do a straw poll, like we split, it's probably
Yeah,
3-2
okay.
one way or another.
All right,
That's
so-
right, as I
In which
recall.
case, I would suggest, since we're obviously not all going in the same direction, like, let's try and get some community input, so it's not.
Right, I mean, I think that's where you're
Yeah.
at. You're probably 3-2 one way or another, so. Mark, is that right? You're still partial to the blue? And if you are, then I think then we are definitely split 3-2.
I don't know what Larry thinks. What does Larry think?
I like the green.
Brian is a green.
Are you agreeing?
Dennis is a green.
Okay.
and Mark, you were blue, right?
How about turquoise? We could mix them.
I mean, I had one more caveat that I was
Teal.
exchanging in email that Connie and Larry were aware of this. Without being too much of a pill, I'm not comfortable with the greens the way they are right now still. I feel like what I said to us was I felt like if you look at these two colors, you got a rich blue and then you got a very less saturated grayed out blue. And when you look at the signs here, the green is much brighter and not grayed out. And what I was telling her, I thought it should be a little bit of less saturated green for the top accent bar, because this comes out almost being as powerful in a different way than, to me, this was a nice, elegant design, and I feel like
Yeah, I agree.
these two blues are in the same family even, except
This
one has
green
more
is
bright.
definitely more of a,
And these two greens are like in totally, one of them has, apparently, at least the way it's printed out, one has more blue in it than the other, and one has more yellow in it than the other. So it just seems like not quite the right color match. That's my only concern is
Are
that.
they able to change that?
Well, we went back and forth with her, yeah. I mean, we had 3 or 4 emails back and forth, and then her final one, these are the 2 greens I recommend.
Now, if you look at the green, what's unusual though is if you look at the green on the tip sheet, the green, C2 green does not look nearly as yellow, and it looks grayer. It looks almost in the same value saturation as the blue in terms of the gray, in terms of the grayness of it. So it's almost as if maybe the right color didn't get put into the
Yeah.
comps.
So we'd ask her if we can go back and tell her that concern with the green, see if she can,
Well, yeah, I did. So
We did that, we went back and forth already.
and this is,
It's just, there was no response to that, so, but, I mean, that was my only thing. If that's the case, if we can get these two both to be kind of like perfect, then I'd be comfortable with it. Right now,
the bright green seems a little off.
it's my aesthetic neuron is just not comfortable yet with this one. I'm happy if the community wants to stay with green, even though I feel like the blue is less cliched for the village in a way. It's kind of more, I don't know what. It's more, certainly, it's a design decision, and there's going to be a number of people who will feel that they don't want to leave the green behind. I can understand.
I always felt like the green was the school. not so much the green was the village. I understand why there's a big concern about the mascot and the green and that whole discussion that's going on about the school, but the school and the village go together, but they're not the same thing. I can see the blue balloons with the green balloons. I think that would look really nice. You know, the school and the village are doing something together, but not that everything, you know, that everything, you know, I guess cliche is a good word, that, you know, it doesn't have to be all green all the time. This is interesting and refreshing.
And then when we did Slow Down Irvington, we had a green Rip Van Winkle. Because I've always thought of green as being the village color, I don't know why.
Can I refer you to the cover of the village code?
So,
Larry, how would you word a survey, or how would you present it to the?
something, I'm not sure exactly how it's gonna be fairly simple, hopefully.
But it does not sound like an insurmountable obstacle to figure out a color palette that does not offend your aesthetic gene.
Yes,
It would be a challenge, but it sounds like it's humanly possible.
Thank you for being understanding. My point is, when I look at these by themselves, I don't have a problem with these by themselves.
You don't like the way it lays out. So let's go back to her, tell her she has to make it.
Well, the darker green though is reserved for the.
That's the OCA. I tell you, that she went back and forth, but fine, she can go back and forth again, but this is what.
So we'll clean up the green.
Parking in the only, like the handicap parking spot. When I see blue, I think two things, handicap parking and Dobbs Ferry.
There you go.
Oh.
So we'll slightly clean up the green.
I think River and Tiffany room.
This thing is, if she wants to talk, I'm more than willing to spend a couple minutes trying to explain on the phone, rather than going back and forth in email.
You know, colors look way different on paper than they do on.
Well, my point was it's
I know.
No.
Than on the screen, so, you know, you got it, but these are Pantone and they are made for print, not for screen, right?
Well,
So will we ask residents to opine only on colors and not on design?
No,
Well,
design
they're
is
used for
done.
different purposes,
correct.
right?
Yes.
This is a family of signs,
Yeah,
nothing
yeah,
either or.
yeah, we're not, it's.
You just dance in a blue or green.
We're trying to focus
It
on
is the
color.
only open question. We love the design, so this is just the only
I
question.
noticed,
Can I make one more point about the blue? When you have the clock tower, why is the clock tower surrounded by blue? Because it's up in the sky, and it's not green. Doesn't that make a design statement?
Yeah, but it's handicap parking. Up in the sky.
Blue sky, as opposed to green sky.
I think it's such a great, this is one of, in my sense, this is one of the most successful conclusions to a consulting project I've seen in a while.
We're actually gonna act on it.
No, it looks good. It's-
Yeah, it looks very good.
It's
Absolutely.
really handsome.
Don't
I
remember
think
growing up
everyone
with
can
those
be,
signs?
It wasn't too expensive as a drug either,
In your
was it?
youth?
No.
Oh, they're there.
No, I mean.
Kids from Dobbs Ferry for that one.
Ah, they're-
They're on.
And they have a whole place.
That's right. Exactly right.
Okay.
Leaf
We don't need
blower.
that. Okay, leaf,
Yes.
yeah, we'll do leaf blowers here. We have till 8 o'clock, so.
Can I make some suggestions on the leaf blowers?
Yes.
Oh, you said you wanted to do something, you said?
Maybe, I was gonna ask if, I was gonna borrow your computers and
Are we starting on leaf blower and
There's a copy.
It's the last page on there.
we have,
It seems to me that there's 3 issues that the law should deal with. Putting aside courtesy of leaf blowing people or whatever, I mean, I don't think you deal with that in the law. And the 3 open questions I see, I just say what the 3 of them are, and then we'll get back to them. One is whether there should be a limit on the decibel level. The other would be whether you want to put limitations on other equipment too, like snow blowers and lawnmowers and whatever. But I don't think that would have to hold this with your leaf blower law, and then just deal with that separately when this is done.
I think this is a separate thing. So.
Right. And then the other thing that I think you've got to think about now, since the time's going on, is when you want it to become effective. It just seems to me that if you say no leaf blowers after May 15th, you haven't given people a chance to get their stuff done. So you should think of it on an effective date, like, whether you want to make it July 1st or whether you don't want to make it effective until the September cleanup or something. And then the only thing I wanted to say on the decibel level, just a practical, I mentioned this to my partner who does a lot of prosecutions in, he's a prosecutor in New Rochelle, he does prosecutions all over. And he said, if you got a resident who got to take level, and they were really playing tough, you can't just say, well, I use this thing. You have to show that it's certified, that the decibel reader is certified, and like radar. Like radar device. I'm just, maybe that can be done. I don't know if it's a big deal. Anyway, I'm just telling you.
Well, it's worse than the radar device, I think, because a radar device is essentially, as long as it's stationary, it's going to give you, doesn't really matter where it is. It's
No. Right, that part is true, the 50 feet, but you do have to come in with proof that it's been certified within, and calibrated certified.
Was it really working at the time? Does it work when it's moist and it's
So basically, if somebody challenges it, it'd be very hard to win.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know, I mean, cops win all the time on the radar thing, they just, they've got their routine and they're calibrated, they get them tested or whatever. I just don't know how much is involved.
Was it the Scarsdale one that said it can't be an annoying sound at the property line or something like that? They weren't talking about leaf blowers in particular, they were just talking about.
No, the Scarsdale one, and thanks for sending that, Marianne.
Yeah.
Was really it was unnecessary noise, and they really just said.
Barking dogs and shouting at people and.
Well,
It's
you know what?
producing an audible sound which is declared to be loud.
Don't understand, you've got the same thing, I just didn't reproduce the whole law. You have a long list of noises. It's not all that different. But the only one,
But they were talking about.
And does it describe the noises as declared to be loud, disturbing, and unnecessary noise in violation of the chapter?
let me, 1 second.
You described the ruckus.
And then there's, I'm sure,
Line about at the property line, right? There's something about at the property.
I'm sure he uses some classic words.
Oh.
Been around for a while.
Here, it shall be this is ours. It shall be unlawful for any person to make, continue, or cause to be made any loud, unnecessary, or unusual noise, or any noise which reasonably either annoys, disturbs, injures, or endangers the comfort, repose, health, peace, or safety of others within the village of Irvington. Both the owner of any instrumentality causing unnecessary noises and its operator shall be deemed to be in violation of this chapter. Property owners who permit, suffer, or allow such unnecessary noises to occur on its property shall also be, I did not write this, shall also be deemed to be in violation of this chapter. And then it's actually almost word for word. The following acts are declared to be loud, disturbing, and unnecessary noises. Horns, signaling devices, etc. Sounding, so
this is nothing.
it's almost the same.
What happens when we get to the paragraph where they talk about blowers? We just don't have that?
Oh, no, yeah, we don't have it, because that would have been new. I mean, it's not, we
So-
have radios, we have loudspeakers,
Right, so
yelling.
their definition of blowers is a little more general than a leaf blower.
The operation of noise creating blower, power fan.
Or any internal combustion engine.
Again, I understand that, limiting other equipment may not be something that should hold this up, but defining it in that way might expand the kind of equipment that we're discussing. As opposed to calling it a leaf blower.
Yeah, but why would you do a blower and not a lawnmower?
I mean, I think would cause a pitchfork moment if we tried to get rid of people's lawnmowers.
So is this getting rid of people's lawnmowers?
Well,
No, the Scarsdale one doesn't, but also snow
any internal
snow
combustion
blowers.
engine
I mean,
operation.
you don't have the same concern about the noise from snow
I think it's
blowers
just not
because
as-
everybody's windows are closed.
But hopefully, you know, you don't have.
Right, and plus the windows are closed. The problem
So it
with
does seem
the
to include any.
leaf blowers is one that they want,
So,
people want to be outside and not have to listen to them, and you have the particulate, spreading.
read G again from Scarsdale, because it says blowers, then it says operation rate noise creation, creating blower or power fan or any internal combustion engine, the operation of which causes noise due to the detonation of operating gases or fluids or the expulsion of air, unless the noise from such blower or fan is, so, I mean, when they say any internal combustion engine, they're still saying within the context of the
Blowing
blower.
air, yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
So you could say something isn't a leaf blower, it's a blower. Well, so this isn't a leaf blower, it's a grass blower.
Well, I mean,
I don't know, I frankly have a problem with their exact language there because, and I don't think a police officer would be sure what it says.
So then the big question is whether we want to build a decibel level here. I mean, at your point that we have to make an effective date, that since this, it cuts off at May 15th, we can't pass it, and then, so we do need to just adopt an effective date.
I think so,
one thing that was interesting from the EPA 2007, whatever guidelines, was in part of their analysis, they had a bunch of tables, and they had lifetime analysis of blower equipment. And it was very interesting that they had the longest lifetime they expected from these blowers was 150 hours, which seems like, that's like a season.
Especially considering, I mean, because I always use my own kind of lawn as an example, which most of the time they don't blow anything. When they do the spring cleanup and the fall cleanup, they do it. It lasts about 10 minutes, and they come once every 10 days or 2 weeks. So like the example we had, the email we got today, the fact that times a week for like 4 hours at a time, it blows my mind. Like,
No, I think she meant collectively, that's what she heard. I don't think she said one neighbor.
right, but it seemed like it's
Surrounding
very close
neighbors.
though. I mean,
Or surrounding
I might be able to find one all the way at the end of my street, but I mean, to me, it's, again, it's proximity, I guess, of the houses.
Yeah, because across the street from me, I mean, right now, you know how fast the lawn is growing, so you get like, I guess they have a contract that they come back,
Once a week or something.
it's like,
Once a week.
yeah, it's like once a week, maybe even not always 7 days. And
I can't believe they blow
they
every week.
come out with blowers, and I actually watched today blowing a few leaves, quite far down the street, even into the catch basin. So it's blowing way more than you need to, and it's loud. I mean, actually, we had our windows closed, but it still was loud,
It's
so.
like a bad technique.
Yeah, it's just, and I don't know, it might be the same names of people she.
So,
So if you use newer equipment, it's getting better and better, shouldn't it?
well, that's the point I was trying to
Yeah.
make, that it should be getting better. But then again, the other issue is that these things have throttles on them, right? So you don't necessarily have to run, this is what some of that California stuff was talking about in terms of courtesy. You don't have to run the blower at full speed, just run it fast enough to get the motion going for which you're blowing, which oftentimes is only partial throttle, right?
Oh, yeah.
So you could cut down the noise significantly if you're not running it full out. But that's just like, again, I don't think you could put, I don't know how you put
No,
it in there, but that's just like,
It's training and
yeah, that's training issue.
education and courtesy and.
Well, that's where some of the handout cards, I think, do make sense.
It could, if we could,
Yeah.
if we gave a short enough set of conditions, and I read through these and I thought they were pretty good in terms of, they kind of very clearly nest and you can figure out quickly. Because I was trying to think, how much text am I gonna have to put on a card, right?
Yeah, so it should be English and Spanish, and it should go to the landscape companies as well as all
Well, it
residents.
needs the basic outline of what the restrictions are, then it needs some courtesy stuff in there.
Yeah, the courtesy stuff, as Marion said, shouldn't be in, nobody has yet succeeded in legislating courtesy. Which we tried.
I think
So we
about a
should-
name for this card, don't blow it. Anyways, but I had a question about,
How are you gonna follow that?
We're gonna find out.
like a red X through the, anyways, no, I don't know what. for that.
We'll leave that.
Yeah.
And whether it's blue or green.
I was just saying, there's some cards are gonna be blue, obviously.
One side is green, one side is blue, one side is English, one side is
Well,
Spanish.
it's just a technicality, and you wouldn't know, because everybody just copies this stuff, and they said, it has to meet the EPA
I know, I read
2007
that.
standard.
There's no more zone.
No. The standards aren't 2007 anymore. Somebody has it in the law, and then everybody just repeats it. Just put the EPA standards, whatever.
Oh, because they didn't update them
Right,
multiple
yeah,
times.
they updated.
But they do discuss,
Yes.
they do discuss that the newer equipment has more, decibel reduction, more muffling, so.
Yeah.
Okay, so the paragraph after number 5, okay, it's not numbered. In addition to the time limitations above,
I'm sorry.
This is on
Page
our
one.
proposed
page
paper.
one.
Okay.
bottom, okay, I have 2 questions about it.
The B?
Yeah, it's big.
Oh, I circled the B and I lost track of B in my.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's true, it's true.
B. Okay. What a metaphor that is. Okay, so in addition to the time limitations above, only one handheld or backpack leaf blower may be used at a time unless the property that is cleared, is being cleaned is greater than 1/2 acre. Okay, so my 2 questions is, if I was to read this as just, Joe landscaper, I would say, you're not putting any limit, I could use one of the push behind things in addition. This says only one handheld or backpack leaf blower may be used at a time. It doesn't say any other ones are restricted.
Well, because all we're restricting are leaf blowers in this.
Well, I'm just saying,
I think the ones, the giant fan ones.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I wonder if we should be very specific in the code.
Just say only one, then only, I got this, I know it, I got it from you, because I remember asking you, our handheld and backpack terms of art. And in fact.
But that's different
So
than
why
push.
don't you just,
one.
I know.
Leaf blowing.
So I think you say, no, only one leaf blower. Just take out the handheld.
What you don't want, no, I'm being very specific here because, I'm sorry, I know what you're saying. You don't want the walk behind used on any small property, period. Those are the noises.
Okay, so if we take,
No,
I'm sorry.
no, we never said that, but if you want that added, we can
Oh, I
add it.
thought we discussed about how those were.
You talked about it, and there was never any agreement that you didn't want to use those.
On small properties, we said that that was probably one of the biggest sources of,
No, but I can put that change in.
how would you word it?
What are they called? I mean,
Push behind?
Take out handheld or backpack and just say only one leaf blower
no,
at a time.
he says he doesn't think they should be used at all.
I think if you're in a small property, a half an
said they
acre, and you
shouldn't
take
be
one of
used at
those,
all.
those by far are like, I mean, those are the old things. Those guys have not been updated.
So he's saying on
So-
property,
One of those and none of the
if
others.
you've got a half acre property, you can only use one leaf blower, but it can't be one of those, whatever, push ones.
So we're not gonna limit the push, it's only necessary to limit the push blowers to half acre or larger properties because they're not gonna be used on smaller lots?
My proposal is we shouldn't let them to be used on smaller lots because those things are really noxious.
No, okay, so let's make sure we're saying it right. So basically, the push behind leaf blowers are prohibited except on lots of greater than a half an acre, in which case only one can be used. Is that what your point is?
Or could you use more than one on a bigger
I
property?
didn't set a limit, I just
Yeah,
said,
you can-
I was just saying here that only one handheld or backpack leaf blower, to me, that's that.
Yeah, okay, so the larger ones, we want to limit them on smaller properties and say they can only be used on,
Larger properties,
okay.
but I don't know if we should say how.
So maybe we shouldn't limit the number. Maybe it's sufficient at this point, because we don't perhaps have enough information about how widely they're used.
That's
Is
what I
to
would
say
say,
that we're just simply limiting the push behind larger leaf blowers.
to larger
To larger
properties.
properties.
I think that's,
But I've never seen one.
I've never seen one either.
oh, they're in use all the time around me, so.
So maybe, but that will do it. Look, this is, has been a long time coming. I think people really want relief as quickly as possible. There's lots and lots of things that we could, try to blow every single leaf off this law, but I think in the interest of, the people who really want some help quickly, that makes sense. Making an effective date makes sense. I think maybe the decibel level is one step too far at this point.
But Mary Ann had a good idea. If you were
Well,
gonna do decibels, you do it at
let's
another day.
finish on this one, okay? This what happened last time, I
Yeah.
jumped around and when it didn't
Then we
come
don't
to
finish,
agreement
so
on
let's
it.
finish.
Okay, in addition to the, so why don't I add after A, the B would be that walk-behind leaf blowers may not be used unless the property that's being cleaned is greater than 1/2 acre.
Okay.
Okay.
And then you would have
Then
a
the
C.
C would be in addition to the limitations above, only one leaf blower may be used at a time unless the property that's being cleaned is greater than 1/2
Only
acre.
one handheld or backpack. I would think you want to keep that language.
What, so you wanna be able to have one handheld and one walk behind?
No,
No, I don't think you want to, A says no walk behinds on less than 1/2 acre. I think
Right.
B is useful to keep, just to keep the language as it is, right there. I don't see why you would take the
No.
conditional.
May not be used. The walk behind can't be used, let's say it can only be used on properties of 1 acre, okay? And then if you don't, if you say in addition to the limitations above, only one handheld or backpack leaf blower may be used, then you could have a backpack leaf blower and a walk-behind leaf blower. Are
only
you
in
saying that's
property
what
you
you
have
want?
it.
Oh, yes, that's how they do it on larger properties.
Yeah.
That's okay with you?
Yeah, I think
So you have to have the little one to clean
yeah,
up.
they usually have two guys as herders and one guy as pusher.
Right.
That's what I see.
Okay, is there anything else, because, we really are trying to get this, we keep jumping all over the place and not finalizing this. What else is open that needs to be decided?
So the question is, I just want to be clear, are we comfortable with 1/2 acre as the break point? Let's be
Yeah, we
clear.
may have to
You
change.
just said acre, so.
No, I
you
was
didn't mean
using
that.
it, no.
Okay, you meant 1/2 acre.
No, I was doing a hypothetical, and I was using an acre as a
All right.
hypothetical.
So just let me know in our zoning code, what is this equivalent to? What's 1/2 acre?
20,000 square foot, so I have 20.
So we are,
Half
most of Sparrow Park is
That's it.
below 1/10 or 1/15 or something? I'm just asking. I know.
I don't know if the zoning applies to neighborhoods. I imagine though, it's certainly not, they're probably want 20,000 or less. Except there could be a bigger property there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how it's zoned, but there could be a bigger property.
There are some along Dow's Lane, but I'm talking about the core of where
They're all much less than
Quarter acres,
yeah.
quarter acre and
Yes,
small.
Sarah,
yeah.
how big is your Sparrow Park?
Very small.
Very small. Smaller than a 1/2 acre.
This sounds like this would go pretty far towards
On,
dealing with
You know,
most of the
tweak it.
problem.
very effectively.
And we could even wait
carve
another
out
month and
multifamily cluster
continue
residential
tweaking or.
developments as being allowed to
I don't want to
use.
do that, I just want to be sure that we're comfortable with.
So are we agreeing we're leaving a decibel level at this point? I'm sorry.
Larry, I didn't hear what you said.
Well, no, wait, but, you already conceded the floor, you yielded
Okay.
the floor, so
right.
finish up your thought.
Um,
Sorry.
And so I thought we had, we seem to now have everything covered. We're just got. No.
No, Larry had another
No, I had a different question.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. So on 10A2, where we effectively carved out an exclusion for multifamily residential developments, what about commercial developments that might be in those same areas? Are they excluded from this carve-out?
So what are we
They're
talking?
not in this carve out, but what commercial ones are there?
Like the Trent building?
Like the Trent building?
Yeah.
Okay.
They don't have
Well,
much grass.
Well, it's not grass, but they use leaf blowers
Ah,
to
they
make
do,
it a
yeah.
little clear
Well,
there.
you could, we can add on commercial.
Yeah, I think
I'm
that.
not sure I want to add them on or not.
What?
I'm not sure I want to add them, I want to exclude them.
Because that also means Bridge Street.
Mostly pavement as well.
Yeah, but they don't really leave.
I know, but
They use it like dirt or gas.
but as it is right now, they
to clear their sidewalk.
Except March through May.
Right, except, but except
Right.
where
This exception is only,
Right.
the only exception would be multifamily
Right,
cluster
residential.
residential.
Okay, as long as that's clear, I agree with that, and I think it's fine.
We might hear.
Okay, are we all good now?
I think I'll take the effective date, if we make it June 15th. Give people,
Yes.
a month from when we pass it.
Are there legal requirements for
Well,
us?
wait, it's not gonna be,
It's not gonna be.
it's not gonna be May 15th.
You're gonna announce it.
call for
Be
the
June
public
1st.
hearing June. I would make it July 1st.
Well, you're gonna,
Then it
you'll
gives
be
you a month.
considering the law on June 5th.
So
It would be effective with the filing.
We can make it July 1, that's fine.
Or July 15th, if it's gonna be
When's
filed.
it? I mean, it would be nice to not have it for the 4th of July weekend. No, I mean.
It's a Tuesday.
we're talking
Put this in here, even if it,
July.
in the first year of the first.
So we meet on the 5th, we'll be voting on the 5th, right? We'll announce it on the 15th for the 5th.
Yes.
And then how long does it take to clear this?
Secretary of State.
Yeah.
By the end of the week, probably.
Make it effective June 30th? Or make it effective July 1st?
Which is a Saturday.
And it can't be used as a, yeah.
Well,
Is that, do you have an issue with that? I mean, and it's people, it's not like, I mean, I know it's not getting past June 5th, so people will know May 15th. I think it would be worth, when you make the announcements, I think you should let people know that, you know.
I'm also sure we could say, for the first offense, they get a warning to, we could.
Yeah, you don't need to, you can just, tell them.
Yeah, absolutely.
They can get a courtesy card, and then that tells them, by the way, this is now the law of the village, the law of the land. So the question is, so obviously the police are gonna be lenient for a while because no one's gonna know about this.
We have to publicize it, through the email blast and the usual, and remind people in the fall. Remind people in the fall, I think will be key as we're getting closer to the fall cleanup time.
So what was the final thing on the amount of time, like 30 days from when we do it, or?
No, July 1st.
July 1st.
Which is like 3 weeks.
Almost.
Okay, decibels?
Nothing now.
No, the only thing I want to point out is we have an implied decibel thing here, implied in 3. 10A3 that says you can't use it without 100 feet of the nearest residence. So,
No, it's only golf and tennis.
I know that, I'm just saying that's an implied noise buffer effectively.
As is the number of leaf blowers. We're doing stuff to reduce the number.
I think we have to do it
Yep.
that way and not through quantitative measure, because it's, like you said, how do you set up 50 feet and then, you say,
Really,
We're operating
in addition to which, if these old ones are dying out, the new ones are below whatever the level is, so it's just not.
except for the push behinds, which are, like I said, are like Volkswagens, people
3 miles an hour.
keep fixing those because they're more expensive. Okay, but anyway.
If I may, while we have 5 minutes, while people are trickling in, the fire department forgot to send me their report. May I read it in now? Can we do that on a work session?
Good. We can say it for Monday, too.
There's no minutes.
Yeah, Monday.
Yeah.
Never mind.
I'll make one unrelated announcement that tomorrow is the deadline to register for the school vote. So if you want to
Oh,
register.
if you're not registered to vote in a school
In
election,
the school election, correct. So tomorrow's the
which
deadline.
is more a broader, not
Yes,
the same as
that's for those words.
Where do you go if you're not registered to
I think
vote?
you can actually go right to the, to the school. To the school.
Wait, Deb is saying it, but I can't hear.
The district has a link for Dave.
Oh,
Yeah.
the district office.
It's-
like,
yeah,
okay,
that's like-
Okay.
Oh.
And
You
that's
go in
like,
person between 7, oh wait, that's actually voting. And if you're not sure if you're registered or not, you can actually call Lane Cardia
Yep, she'll tell you.
at 591-8501. Easy number, 8501. So. And there's also, on Thursday, May 11th, from 4 to 8 p.m. in the lobby of the Main Street School, you can also register.
oh,
And then the district office is 9 a.m. to 3:45 p.m. So,
district office and the Lane Cordega.
yeah, or you can come to Main Street School if you don't want to go all the way to Dow's Lane.
Okay.
And bring a leaf blower.
We got our whole committee here, wow. That's.
just for 5 minutes.
No,
We're good?
they're good to go. Oh, Earl's behind you. We have to turn around.
We're just waiting on our.
Perfect.
It's not quite eight.
No, it's not.
But you're only here. Wow, except for all. That's
It's
amazing.
got 4 minutes.
Are we gonna want us to move to see? I mean, should we be like around over here, kind of?
You have guides to hand them, right? That's really for the.
Oh, for the other people?
Yeah, I think Earl has
Earl
the
has-
guys.
Oh.
Yeah.
If you have you guys have seen them as PDFs.
Yes. If you have the guides though, you can't turn it on.
I'd like to be able to see up there too. I'm gonna move over
I
here.
can sit at the end if it was.
You know, if you wanna stay there, that's fine, but I wanna move, so I like seeing it on a big screen.
Here he is.
Oh, next, switch chairs.
It would have been unusual if he did.
I wanna sit like, I don't have a chair, it's good, but now we don't have a chair.
Earl,
so-
Earl, do you have copies?
Do you have additional copies?
Connie, why don't you come here?
Oh, that's better, that's
Earl?
fine, that's fine.
Do you have the printed copies?
Hi, hi, hi. That's good. Okay.
I also have one of this.
Oh, my God.
Hello. Thank you.
You have yours, I see.
As Earl is handing these out, if I can recognize that there are members of the Historic District Committee who are here. Becky and Neil and Doug and Dr. Weiler and an honorary member, Sarah. A Historical Society representative who will all have comments on it. But, Earl, do you want me to do any introduction?
Oh, yeah, that would be great.
Well, just to say that this committee was formed in like 2013 and tasked with several important jobs, one of which was to come up with a historic district guide document. And, I mean, I've been meeting with this committee for, how long? 2 years? 2 years? Yeah. So, I think you will see the fruits of a lot of labor from a lot of diverse residents who have had input here. But I would say that there's an incredible amount of comparison with other documents. And then the very final part of this, which probably will come out in their presentation, is that after all the volunteer work, the last thing that happened was that Stephen Tilley, who you know probably as a professional who works on these kinds of historic documents and is an architect, he did the final work on this, and the committee has gone back and forth with his work. And you guys have heard this presentation twice, I think, but this is further along than obviously it was when you heard the presentation before. Okay. Oh, that's right, Larry, it's not, unless you watched it on the archive meeting.
might have been in the audience.
You might. So anyway, I'm just gonna officially thank the committee for doing so much work. Okay,
The thing in my phone.
right, even though nobody paid attention to that. You know I said it.
Great.
Okay,
Based on.
all right, so,
And thank you to the board
Right.
as well.
Sure.
We're going to have Deb and John give the presentation.
take it away.
So, when we were last here, we looked at the draft, and I think earlier in our discussions about what we wanted the guide to be, was we had always focused on it being an educational guide first. Like, the goal was to have an education component for owners of the historic district to sort of identify what is valuable about their house, what leads to historic character. And we hope that we've done that. That's sort of been the direction of the guide. The guide is intended to sort of set a common baseline for people that are doing work in the historic district, whether they're adding to an existing historic building, whether they're repairing an existing building that's considered contributing, or whether they're building a new building that's in the district that isn't contributing or isn't considered contributing. The situation in terms of how the projects in the historic district are going to be dealt with is not dissimilar from the process that's in place right now. So the ARB, anytime you do anything to the outside of the building, whether you're here in the historic district or you're elsewhere, you always are in front of the ARB. One of the things that people have brought up in the past about going in front of the ARB is that they are very far down the road by the time they're in front of the Architectural Review Board when they arrive at the ARB. So if the ARB says we don't like what you're doing, or they have some issue with it, it's difficult to be so far down the path and to make modifications late in the process. So the goal here is to sort of set expectations and set a common ground that people would have at the front end of a process. So we think it would improve the process to have this guide in place, because before, when you start a project, you sort of are looking at the same thing that board members are looking at. You're looking at the same thing that the architect should be designing. It should be, everyone should be on the same ground, and we think that would very much smooth the process. The other thing that we focused here that you noticed as we looked through is that in many municipalities, ones that have very strict historic districts, the guide is very prescriptive. It says this is what you do and this is what we'll accept. Sometimes it's actually legislated. In this case, we made a specific decision early on, which you guys were involved with, that we weren't going to write legislation that told you what your window needed to be or anything like that. So the goal of this is that it is presented in terms of recommendations, things that we think are the right answer given the fabric of the area. And that is twofold, because you also don't want these things to be so strict that they limit the creativity of designers that come in there, or they supersede the judgment of a board member. So like part of what we were trying to do here is to make sure that these guidelines are not the end all of what people are using to make decisions, because there's a lot of other criteria that can never be covered in the guide, no matter how long it was. And so that is part of the goal here, and that's why it's also indicated as recommendations. One of the things just that I want to mention on the education side, this book, as you get towards the end of the guide, there is a whole series of resources, and Sue on our board has gone to great lengths to get all of those resources in the library. So we're trying to make sort of more of a coordinated effort in terms of the education. The guide has been to ARB. We've been working with Marianne, obviously, and we've been working with the committee. The guide went to ARB on Monday, so we had a discussion with them. There were a few items that they had mentioned that were really specific to the language of the guide, but the one that they really hit on hardest right at the beginning was the concern about access. They really wanted to make sure that people that end up in front of their board, applicants that end up have access, they know this exists, they've looked at this before, they've designed. So we talked loosely about what that would mean, where the guide would be positioned on the village's website, where it would be positioned in the process, just to make sure that people have access to it. And one of the things that was discussed was having a general email blast just to indicate where it is, position it, if it could be located in such a way, from the point of view of a design professional, when you go to a new municipality to do work, if you end up in the zoning section and you read the zoning to try to indicate what limitations there are in that area. So if we could get it in the way of that, when someone reaches for zoning or goes online reaching for that, clear that this document's in the way. And then there was also discussions about hard copies and how that might be used. So we could talk about that more. The other ARB comments were a few cleanup things that we had. We had some language about solar panels in here, that there was a concern that the solar panel language might contradict the recent solar law, so that we're going to clean that up. And I think in the copies that you're looking at, that hasn't been cleaned up yet, but it will. There was another concern about language about railings, existing historic railings. There was an issue about life safety. Like the guideline says, it's best to not to change the pattern of a historic railing, and the ARB was concerned, like,
It's a
well,
pattern in space.
pattern and spacing, so, the issue is there are modern codes, the building codes, the life safety code is always going to supersede anything that's in that guide, so there was a little bit of concern, so we sort of clarified that. And I think the last thing was, one of the board members was looking for us to make the window section more expansive, like go into different types of historic areas. So if and we could look into that if the board wants us to, but, part of what we've done here is, this is not so comprehensive that it's the same as a textbook on the topic. So there is sort of like, you'll need additional resources beyond what's on the guide in some cases. And we think the window section is pretty detailed. And then there were a few ZBA comments that I think have more to do with the linking law, that is the ARB, the changes to the ARB law that reference the guideline, and you've already.
I already fixed them. I sent the revised local law around to everybody yesterday. You guys had it too.
Right, and I mean, that was, one of them was about clarifying the Board of Trustees options when they're at appeal. The other text changes, I think, were minimal that we picked up. So we were hoping that if you guys had a minute to, if you reviewed it or looked at it, had any questions, I mean, we can go through and go to specific sections if there's specific questions on it.
John, just in terms of talking about access of this to people, when a new buyer buys a home in the historic district, are they officially informed that they are purchasing
that's
a home in the historic district?
This is sort of the crucial part.
Realtor.
Yeah, like
How should real estate officers have this?
Right.
Becky's a realtor.
I can answer that.
Okay.
Actually, we are talking about that now because we really don't have it yet. So I personally have talked to some people about it, but it's not official, so. But when it is official, yes, there's a place on the form that says historic district.
I mean, the historic district itself is official. It's
Right,
just that
not the
this is-
guidelines.
Right, it's not official.
But not that many people are using it. Because because we don't really have regulations like, say, in Brooklyn or anything like that yet, so. Did I answer your question?
Like I say, the thought though is that we would educate the realtors, give copies, make sure that they're aware that the guidelines exist, and really do whatever we can to make sure that we have this document readily available for anyone in the village who's looking to buy.
So the process would be, if I was an architect or a contractor who had not worked in the village, which was potentially the first time in, or had my head in the ground like an ostrich for quite a while, would obviously go to the website to do your due diligence, so there must be a way to, a good place to put information there. And then you would probably also go to the building department, I would imagine, to ask questions even before, to try to figure out more about the process, most likely, since it's not explained anywhere that clearly. So I would imagine it would make a lot of sense to maybe have some kind of signage or something at the building department and allow people to pick up a copy. I mean, for the nominal cost of what, $5 or whatever it is to make a duplicate.
One of the recommendations from the zoning board on our group, Bruce made in our group of comprehensive plan, is that he thought that when you went in to get a building, you filled out an application for a building permit, you actually had to sign off that you either received a copy of the guidelines or that you have received an electronic copy. He even went so far as to suggest that we should charge the applicant $5 for the cost of the copy.
But going in for a permit, but that's
Later in the
later in the
process.
process.
I think what Bruce was probably intended was wherever you are earlier in the process that you may want to, because there is something like in a site development portion of it, the site development, there is a checklist, it could be added to the checklist, have you,
Definitely.
know.
In as many places as possible, because it seems like experience with the public is that everyone professes ignorance of being, in front of any of the particular signaling mechanisms, right? It's like, I didn't get the email, I didn't see that in the newspaper, no one told me.
And one of the suggestions that came out of the ARB meeting also was that if the architects are making submissions electronically, we could go through the efforts to identify those architects who usually practice or readily practice in Irvington, and we could email them and attach a copy of the design guide announcing that it's now in place.
So are these all gonna be like recommendations for dispersal? I mean, are you gonna put together like a little, we've heard about 5 or 6 things so far. So
I mean, we could put together the list of what we think would work. I mean, I don't know, Larry, is there an issue with using stuff that, the emails that came in to building permits, those emails as, using them as an email blast? I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know how that system is structured.
Right.
I mean, we could look into.
But, you know, that we can sort of just list the ideas that we've come up with. But I just wanted to bring it up that of the ARBs, of the Architecture Review Board's concerns, really, the only one was, we love it, we just want to make sure it's in people's hands. You know, that was really sort of the message that we got, except for a few small things that were.
So the Windows stuff, because I was there listening about how they thought it might, more detailed, might be good for public. So, well, what additional resource would be required? Is that an extra page or an extra spread?
Well, I think that's, you know, it may involve going back to Ken and asking again, just for him to clarify what, you know, where does he want us to go? And we can go back to the consultant and Tilly and say, what would it take for you to give us
So
some
we
more
can give us numbers
paragraphs?
to say.
Yeah, if we think that's important. One of the things that has come up and you know, on our committee was like, well, you know, we've tried to have a relatively even hand across all the topics. So if you make one topic more extensive, does it take the thing out of balance? I think windows are something that comes up a lot. It's sort of a more important thing. So I mean, if one was 1 page longer than the other, I'm not sure it's a big deal one way or the other. So Ken wants something in there where it makes sense.
Well, I was you know, a spread would make it a lot easier to lay out than if you had to shift it.
All right, yes, I know, right.
One idea too was that if windows, if one wanted to look into historic windows in greater depth, it could be added as a link in the resource section.
Yeah, I think
That's probably a minimum, but I think that might be workable unless we experience the fact it's not sufficient.
we can ask the
I mean,
chair.
there
or
was,
ask-
when that comment came back, I know the 3 or 4 things after Monday night, we were sitting together and going through those 3 things. And there were just 3 or 4 words you added.
We did
in
make a
response,
correction,
and
but
that's-
part of what Ken wanted was just a clarification that the top sash and the bottom sash of the double hung sometimes don't have the same pattern.
So there was this
Yeah,
little
so-
phrase
so we
here.
We added
be
that.
enough.
Right,
Yeah, we
that's
added
what I'm
that.
saying, right? The upper and lower sashes are often not divided the same way.
Right.
I mean, that's a simple way to
Just address
add a
what
little
was
bit of information without going the route, unless, you know,
And
that's,
then make a reference in the back maybe.
Right.
Yeah, and it's consistent
So-
with the illustrations.
Yes, exactly.
so that goes right there. The same way with the other 2 or 3 things, looking at those comments from the night before, it wasn't that hard. In fact, you'll probably want to look at what the wording was on the solar section.
Yeah.
It seemed to clarify it, that was.
Yeah, I think the solar panel indicated that it was recommended that you do this lower impact solar.
Yeah.
So we changed that language to be like, if you're in that storm district, you may want to consider doing a lower impact, because really the guidelines that are associated with solar should govern. And so we took that language of recommended out of that.
Yeah, because it really,
Do you remember what page?
Yeah,
it was?
21.
21.
Yeah, you don't want to get into a situation where someone said, well, this company do this and this, that, you know, like, I think, we just wanted to highlight that it has, you know, consider it, and then the other rules should go.
not recommended.
Right, it just,
So
that
that-
was good to you?
Yeah, the question I had was, because that got me thinking about what does recommended and not recommended mean operationally to the ARB, right? It's one thing to just say, you know,
We had a long discussion about that.
do you know what I'm saying? Because
Well,
if
this is what when we spoke to the ARB, and you can't guarantee that in the future people will use it the same way, but the intent is not to, you know, supersede the brains and the judgment and the thinking of the ARP. This is the whole language. Like a lot of these guys are listed, they say should and shouldn't, or must or must
Yeah,
not.
I understand.
And so the choice is recommended. Like there wasn't a lot of words that you can use that can go wider than recommended and still have some force to them or some clarity to them.
Well, it's all in the kind of, my take was, it was all in the kind of light-handed, informational, and, sort of pulling someone aside and saying, hey, before you make a decision, you should sort of think about these things. And here's the background you need. And in that, you're helping them by saying, this is good stuff, this is probably going in the wrong direction. And that, I can understand is recommended, not recommended. I just want to be sure that we're careful that it's, this is going to be coming to the, if we adopt it, we'll be coming to the BOT to make a decision about what it means. So it's not going to be quite the same level of legal force, because someone's...
Well, that the legislation, and we can look at that too tonight, but the legislation says, the ARB will be guided by this, and there's been a lot of discussion about what that means. It's you're to be guided by this, and you're to be guided by other things as well, but it doesn't mean that it's not the same as saying it must be this and it must be that.
Well,
and actually, at some point during the finalization of this, we did a word search and we found all the musts. Because we did found the shoulds and the musts, and there was no eight of them in there somewhere that we found. Just make sure that we're clear, and there's a few musts that are still in there because it's like a different sentence, it's not about description. But so we did check, and we've been sort of careful to do that, and that was really our opening statement to the ARB. Just be clear what the committee's intent is, not to erase your judgment or supersede your judgment. Like the committee is. Because, the test, we talked about this, the test for an ARB or for a historic district is, can the Octagon House still happen? Right. Something, but the 2017 version of the Octagon House, you don't want to make sure that doesn't happen, right? Because the things that we're trying to protect in these districts are the cool things, that are the more creative things, right? So, that's the danger of these kind of things. And that's why we were trying to make sure that it was clear that these are recommended.
At the same time, the board would not be limited by this. It's not so prescriptive that the ARB would feel that they've got to check off every one of these criteria.
And the other thing I would add, having the advantage of actually sitting on the ARB, is that we went through the document very carefully and looked at every single bullet that appears under recommended. And these are things that we're actually saying at the ARB to the applicants, but now what the applicant has as an advantage is it's now in writing and they get to read it before they appear. So when we went through these, the things that are not recommended, we would tell the applicant it's not recommended, and we still have a conversation. Sometimes they come back, which we've had often happen, and actually say, what you're not recommending is what I want. And we have to have that conversation, and many times the applicant walks away with what they want. It's just not something we're recommending. That makes sense. So this document is not changing any of that. It's really just putting it in writing so that everybody has an opportunity now to know this in advance.
Would you say, I don't know, John, maybe you're Earl or would you say that if the architects and design professionals who finally come to the ARB after all the whatever long work they did, if they're coming finally to the ARB and they have had this, would it be more likely a smoother, faster process with the ARB? I mean, can you imagine or not? Or
Wildly smooth.
wildly?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I'm not just saying it, our office tends to, when we have buildings that are sort of older historical, and we tend to follow a lot of these practices already, but I have been at meetings where people are just not thinking that way, and different professionals, and this would help a lot. And there's been recent ones where this would help a lot.
I'd add though, that I think this guide is actually more important to the individual who appears before the ARB that's not represented by an architect. And we get many of those applicants, because some folks are just coming into us with a fence or one window or a door replacement. And one of the things that I really appreciated about being on this committee is that we're comprised of architects as well as non-architects and realtors and folks that live in the historic district and outside of the historic district. So really we've gotten many voices that have looked at this and gone through it very closely to make sure that it makes sense. And the education you're getting as somebody without a degree in architecture is really what I think is the biggest benefit. I think the architects can easily work with us when they come before the ARB. It's the folks without that background that have the hardest time.
But those who, say, okay, I see, this is an address, it's in a historic district, oh, I see, I looked on the website, I see there's a design guide, if you're doing anything in the historic district. Okay, before I even start making my little drawing about how I would do this addition, let me see. Seems like by the time you would get there, both with an architect or without, you'd be better informed, and the process there would be less for you guys to do, and the
It would be
ARB.
more efficient and less costly.
Yeah, faster, not needing to come back, perhaps, or,
Right.
I mean, if people really get it and understand that, oh, okay, well, maybe that'll work, so.
Right. I think it should do that.
The process would be clarified, the entire application and approvals process, and the steps that one needs to take to get to approval would be much more clarified than it has been.
And again, I think the strongest features of the guide are the photos, because we don't have that advantage on the ARB. We can't really pull up, on the slide, what we really are hoping you guys are gonna be doing is a window like this, or a fence that has more of this detail. Now we have a guide that we can actually have a conversation with the applicant, and actually flip them to page 26 and say, that's what we're trying to describe.
So it seems like in terms of the process, and I know there's been discussion about how it's still going to be important for the ARB to somehow get feedback to the planning board earlier in the process of the site plan flow. A lot of this is is essentially post planning board, but the one area that isn't, that it's not. It's one of those kinds of back and forth, I guess you go around it, but it's when you're adding an addition or modifying a facade or something like that, where it's actually changing the massing. That's something where you're still in a case where you probably want the ARB to have feedback sooner in the process than later.
We had a discussion with the ARB, that's another thing, and the group with Marianne had yesterday sort of talked about clarifying that the ARB does have the right to, give their comments, and they are supposed to be receiving all the new planning board applications. So they can, the same way that the village engineer and the village landscape board, they can give their comments to the planning board early in the process. And that's something that they seem interested in doing. I think it's just a matter of them doing that work on the ARB level.
Their own process.
To get that. But, one of the things that this does is that whether the requirements that the ARB needs in the historic district are going to be available to the design professional before they start the process with the planning board. So there's not the same kind of potential where you're going to go through the planning board process and then only consider what the building looks like or the impacts that it has on the historic character of the district after you get through planning board. Because now this is available, so that it doesn't matter that you don't meet with the ARB earlier, at least in this district. At least you would have you'd have some sort of common ground and guidelines associated with it. So it's not going to blindside you when you get through, because you have the access as soon as you know you're in the district.
On that subject, and we didn't talk about it yesterday, what might be helpful is to also have this conversation, or at least a memo to the planning board, sending this thing, saying that if you happen to get an application that's in the historic district and they haven't been to the ARB, you might want to get their input soon.
That's a good idea.
That would be helpful. You could do that along with sending a copy of the guidelines, even though for the most part it wouldn't be relevant to what they're doing, but.
And there is kind of direction in here about massing and stuff that is relevant. And again, it's not different than how everyone's behaving already. The planning board is sort of behaving in line with what's saying here. The ARB is behaving in line. It's just now that it's.
Well, it's frequently happened that something, it really seemed like that one of the issues was an architectural issue, and they asked for the ARB's input. But this would probably happen more.
I think so.
Yeah.
If I may, one of the things, when you first presented this, I shared that, and I still feel this was an amazing effort. It's obviously a labor of love. It is so clear. It's educational without being insulting. It's really, I don't know anything about approvals. Let me see. but it also is set up in such a way that it invites buy-in. So that a person considering buying a house in the historic district who gets this put into their hands is going to, oh, I see what they're trying to do here. So this is terrific. I also really want to emphasize how much I support these being recommendations, just what you said. That I think is essential. Because some of the little diddly things as I was going through here, I understand most of the do this, don't do porch. You can see why a person might want to do that. It might be considered necessary to their family needs. So the fact that it's recommended and that there can be a little play in the joints, discussing this back and forth is essential.
And this is, if you weren't doing that, you don't need a board to review. I mean, if you could actually legislate a checklist, if you have to do all of this, then you don't need the people. So this is the point of having the board. I think that was always the intent.
We wanted it to be educational and inspiration.
Yeah, it's not just it's not dreary educational. This is, really so well illustrated and it explains it so well. It's true.
Yeah, it makes it exciting for someone, I would think, that was looking to own a house in the historic district.
Steve Tilley's drawings are very nice, his hand drawings. And Andrew Koch thought Doug did them. And Doug was like, yeah, he didn't quite hear the question.
And started taking credit for the drawings. I was like, you did
We're gonna change
I mean,
that.
I would say that
I'm gonna redraw them
I want you to read all them all.
Steve Tilley has been very generous with his time, his staff, his whole office. I think, again, this is a labor of love for him too. I mean, he worked on the library, he's been intimately involved with projects in Irvington, and he's put in way more.
They're quite proud of it too.
Right, I think they are proud of it.
We weren't the easiest clients.
We're not done.
That's all we kept saying.
Right, so, we were saying that we hand wrote in a few things on Tuesday. I know there could be, I thought there might be some things that, this board would come up with that were little additions. I know Rick's thing about the fences, we have a little thing written in here now that seems to fix that. The Historical Society, I think, had a couple of things, and then there was just one other comment from Bruce Clark. And I don't think anything ever came in from the planning board, but I can tell you the comment from Bruce, other than the one that is in the, or do you want to talk about the legislation?
Or should we finish off on the guide and then go to
Anybody want to see a presentation?
Oh, yes, we do.
So Deb, let me just ask you, and I guess Rick too, so I'm correct in understanding that this really isn't changing the way the ARB was viewing things from how they had done it before. This is just sort of putting it all in one place.
That's certainly how it was designed and presented, and I understand from Rick as well as the other members that that's how they accept it as well, that no one is taking away their ability to have a conversation with the applicant and review them individually and case by case. So yes, I think that it's going to work out well.
And also to your question, I think you guys should do the presentation, then.
Oh, well, I mean, I think we just have this guide. I mean, I don't know if you guys want to go through all the guide.
That's what I was asking if the board.
I think, yeah, absolutely, because then anybody, people, residents can watch this session.
Okay.
You don't have to read every word.
But Larry, another important aspect to that, your question about whether the behavior of the ARB is similar to what it was before, is that we'd like this to not add another layer of bureaucratic process, to an applicant. In other words, it's not a different board that you have to go to.
Or it meets demands
at a different time. Yeah, and it's ARB agenda would stay the same.
But can I also just, because it's what they're usually addressing, but it's now a book, it gives them a little bit more, it makes it seem more, like when they say something, it doesn't seem arbitrary, like, oh, this does, it gives what they're saying a little more strength, so that, it's harder to argue against it, right?
I agree, more authority too.
more authority. Thank you, that's
What it also does is clarifies the issues that we're looking at as we do our jobs. So, as you said, it's not an arbitrary, it doesn't appear to be an arbitrary opinion that we're taking. It's based, now we have something to base our opinions on, so it's helpful in that respect.
When they don't all have to agree, kind
We can walk you through
Yeah.
quickly for those
Do
who
you
are
want to
viewing.
do lights or not? Can you think we can do
It's such a film or nothing on our lights, unfortunately.
Oh.
I think it seems very bright.
I think it's here. It is, yeah.
Okay, we'll just walk you through it quickly, because it's a long document, but basically the first few pages take you through, and I won't obviously point out all the photos too, but take you through a general introduction. The guide was designed to be user-friendly, and we've broken it down into several parts so that it's easy to find where you need to look if you have a particular application, so you don't feel like you have to read the entire guide to get an answer. You can go right to one particular part of your house or commercial property if you're looking to appear before the ARB on that. So the first few pages will actually explain to you how to use the guide. It's broken down into the 3 sections: residential, we grouped the second one, Main Street, commercial and institutional, and then we grouped the third category of buildings within the historic district, waterfront, industrial. And each of those sections are color coded, so you can, if you happen to have a color copy, you could look to the bottom and flip to it. We also gave you an icon so that you knew which one was residential, which is commercial, and which one's waterfront, industrial, in case you're looking at it in black and white or on your screen or some type of tablet. Once you go into part 1, we thought what was beneficial is to go through the history, the boundary, and the overview of the Irvington Historic District, tell you a little bit about how Irvington was founded, its residents, its famous heritage, and then we actually walk you through what it means to form it in Irvington Historic District, and in particular when Irvington was formed. We explain that in the Irvington Historic District, there's 2 categories of buildings, contributing and non-contributing, and there's a map that follows that actually identifies those within our historic district, giving you the boundaries that are contributing, non-contributing, and you can see how it runs. I don't know if Early want to give them a little bit more detail on that.
It really is identifying the map, and it has a legend that shows which buildings in the map are contributing, which are considered non-contributing. And then it shows green areas as well, open space as well.
And a contributing building is really one that has all of the significant attributes of what was necessary to qualify to be within the historic district. Earl was the one who had more of the labor of love of actually going through each building, identifying them and the characteristics and what it was that made them, I wouldn't say unique, but what is the word? Identifiable, significant.
As contributing to the historic character of the district itself.
So a non-contributing building would exist in the district, but isn't historically valuable in and of itself in the same way as the contributing buildings?
correct.
There's very few,
That's
there's
a
not
good
that many non-contributing.
Well, it seems like there are,
There were only,
seems like there are a lot of non-contributing.
And where?
I think the
streets.
end of Cotton at the end of South Juncture, where there's
So
more.
if you were a homeowner of a non-contributing building, you wouldn't be held to the same level of oversight as the ARB.
The recommendation's a little bit different. Right. I mean, I think that the thing to remember about this district, it's a contributing building in this building, in this district is not the fanciest, most beautifully detailed historic building. It's just one that has a certain character that is from the period that set the district. So the non-contributing doesn't mean that they're bad buildings, it's just like some of them are 60s or 50s buildings, and this district is sort of established around the 1880s. So that's part of it, is you wouldn't want to apply, 1890s rules to the 60s building. Yeah.
It would be a weird. What is used?
Well, no, the ARB would, this is used, but the ARB also just would continue, when you have a.
We're talking about the code now calls out that they use this guideline for non-contributing.
Well, no, there's sections in the guideline about how to deal with non-contributing stuff.
Right, and it's mostly issues with scale and proportion and picking up datums. But
Can I just read that over there?
It's section 5, I believe, or 5, which is,
Page 4D.
And just while
or
you're,
4.
right, and just while you're looking, just to confirm, so there's 274 contributing
Or 5.
buildings, structures rather, and there's 44 non-contributing, just so you have it in proportion.
The majority. Another thing about the criteria is that you could have a building that was built in 1850, so it may qualify in terms of the age criteria, but that it's been altered to such a great extent that its historic defining character has been lost.
And if you look on page,
Some of the non-contributing are in that category in addition to modern buildings.
and if you look on page 7, we clearly state that a non-contributing building is one that does not represent the historic character of the district, either by being constructed after the period of historical significance or due to significant modifications made to an original historic structure. So those are the two basic categories.
Part of the reason to have some recommendation associated with a new building or a non-contributing building is that, a new building can do different things to the historic character depending on what it does. And we've had discussions here about like if you build a new building on a street where, there's a certain rhythm or a certain historic, and you build it in such a different way that it has a negative impact on the other things. I mean, that's really what is in that section.
We continue to give you a little bit of an overview of the benefits of a historic district on page 9. We continue on page 10 to give an explanation of what the National Register of Historic Places and federal guidelines are. Sometimes there's a little bit of confusion as to what our historic district is as opposed to the federal Register of Historic Places. We indicate, though, that we're all attempting to do the same thing, which is to identify, retain, and preserve to the extent possible, and protect, maintain, and repair. If you go to page, 12, part 2, we then walk the reader through the summary of historic styles in Irvington. And we give you a little bit of background in the introduction to styles. You can see there's some great photographs with captions underneath. In the residential styles, there's quite a few pages that take you through all the different styles here in Irvington. Again, all of these photos are homes within Irvington.
And if I would just interject, as somebody who isn't an architect, and this has enabled me to just look different.
As you walk up and down the street. It's also fun to figure out if you didn't know what type of house you had. So you can get a little, it's definitely you view Irvington differently. Page 17 will take you through Main Street commercial and institutional styles. You'll recognize Tudor Revival. You may learn a few things about Richardsonian Romanesque, which I never heard of before this committee. Then you move on to waterfront industrial styles.
This one's important though.
Is it? Okay.
So the Richardson one you make fun of, so one of the great, one of the great battles,
2 years ago.
architectural battles.
Yes.
If you guys know the Boston Public Library,
Yes.
which is McKinley and White, and across is Trinity Church, which is Richardson. And there was sort of, those two were sort of battling it out, they were duking it out. And actually the library, McKinley and White's library was sort of a response to Richardson, sort of like a battle of the architects at the time. And it's funny that we have the Trent building and a little Richardsonian thing doing the same kind of battle as Trinity Church and Boston Library. Just
Very
it's
cool.
funny.
See, Brian?
Wow.
Thanks.
Of course, you could have made it all up in just a second. I've been in Boston.
A little bit of architectural geekery.
I never heard the term architects.
No, it's not John First himself, though.
You're surrounded by them right now.
That's how I got that bottle.
Part 3, which begins on page 19, sets forth the guidelines for modification, renovation, repair, and expansion.
That'll get a lot of use.
Yes, and this is where we give you a little introduction, and then we actually break it down and walk through the different parts of residential buildings, beginning with roofing. And page 21 is actually the first page that sets forth recommendations. And again, it pertains to roofing. We don't really need to go into any detail unless you have any questions. We already pointed out that as to that box and caption as to rooftop solar, We did change that so that the two photos that appear, instead of saying recommended and non-recommended, we actually labeled what it is you're looking at. So, that
Yeah,
we're
one
looking at
says, one says like integrated, low profile solar, and the other one says
Yeah.
high profile.
high profile, so, as opposed to that they're recommended or not recommended, we tell you what they are. And the link is correct, it does take you to our guidelines here in Irvington, so that if you're looking at this electronically, you can go right to it.
Solar, okay.
Solar guidelines. And then, page 22 discusses exterior materials and trim. Again, examples here in Irvington. The recommendations are on page 23. We continue with porches, porticos, and front entrance. Recommendations are on page 25. Windows continue. That's the section that the ARB was commenting that it may be helpful to give more examples for those of us who go before the ARB and aren't as familiar with what are typical representations here in Irvington and what they're called. Right now, it's 2 pages, and on page 27 are the recommendations as to windows.
That's the thing about the recommendations is that it's going to be helpful to the homeowner to, like, particularly with the roofing, pointing out things like get the right kind of flashing and don't only replace it this particular way once every couple of years. So just for basic knowledge of how to get the most value, the most sensible kind of investment.
True. And there's quite a few recommendations as to maintenance too, that sometimes you think you have to replace it and it actually is less expensive to repair.
And the resources also are very rich in educating people about that.
We continue with doors on page 28. Some good examples here in Irvington on residential houses. The recommendations, again, try to remind those who are looking to replace that you want to match the original door type. And a few other comments. Fences, which we see a lot of in front of the ARB, so there's some good examples of the different fences that are here in our historic district. We talk a little bit here about the height, and we do have different materials, and we're not looking to make everything the same, and just trying to honor what was in front of the house originally. And then walls and paving follow on page 31, and then we move to Main Street commercial and institutional.
And so the commercial guys, the reason they're broken down is there's just some different components to a commercial building than there would be residential portions. So we have the storefront section, which is sort of the most character-defining portion of the commercial buildings that we have on this slide. And, you know, mostly it's going to be about trying to honor the character of the existing building in terms of instead. You see a lot. There was a building that was brought back. I think when it was the insurance firm that had the bird inside of it.
Yes.
What was that?
Murphy's.
So that was sort of the strategy that happened, that you know, to modernize these buildings. They got closed in, very small windows, and so I think, you know, with storefronts, in order to keep the open character of the main street, that's sort of crucial. And cornices are something that's specific. So there's a lot of guidelines for cornices, and then signage and awnings.
Which again, we give you the link to the
Yeah, the signage, I think we looked at pretty closely in terms of making sure it coordinated and didn't undercut or confuse the ordinance. And the waterfront district tries to identify things that are important in the waterfront district in terms of character defining things like the smokestack. Semi-towers. Yeah. I know. We could have photoshopped those out.
Just say match the color.
Right. The next section is about the additions and additions and new construction. So this is the thing that we said may have relevance to even planning board level review in terms of discussions of massing. You know, it's really mostly about the relationship between the addition and the new, and to make sure that the addition does at least honors the original. There's a thing about Boston, that was a long time ago. There was this building that was part of Mass General on Starrow Drive, where there was a modern addition to a historic building. This is again the 70s, like so brutal the 70s stuff. And the historic building was in the bottom, and there's a new concrete thing on top of it that had like legs coming. It was like the thing was being trapped by a giant spider. The poor thing was underneath it. I mean, that's like the, sort of one of the most brutal, weird examples of what to do with a historic building. So this is just, let the addition maybe, not drive the bus. There's also a little bit about street pattern on the next one in terms of how,
that's
just a street period.
That's important stuff, but my question is, it's one of those gotchas because to match an existing street pattern in the side streets, you have to go to the zoning board to get.
This is something that we promised to talk to you about. This is on our list. We'll get back to that.
That's part two.
At least now it can be used as an argument when they come forward. To say,
right. I mean, I think we do owe you that, and we know that. So
yeah, okay.
Recommendation. Yeah.
Right,
And then, so this next section that we're at 40 is the non-contributing buildings, sort of direction on how you might position a non-contributing, or sort of develop a non-contributing building for a
I'm scared that go fast while you're.
Wait, on that page, on 41, well, I don't know.
41.
Right there. There are two places where some interesting, important language was added from when you guys saw this the last time after quite a bit of conversation about how this would be used. If you look on 41, this is one of them in that paragraph above the box. It starts with, in the way in which the historic district differs from the rest of the village, it goes on. And the last part of that says in that sentence, in reviewing any application in the historic district, the ARB shall take into consideration the costs associated with implementing recommendations in this design guide. And that appears two places in the guide. So just as Deb and John and others were talking about the flexibility, if there's a decision that would be nice, but it's incredibly more expensive, it's actually gives the ARB, I mean, they would anyway, but explicit information to use good judgment in terms of what's realistic in terms of cost. If it's a little bit more cost, but it would make a giant difference on the project, well then, the equation might come down a little differently. But I think this was a very wise thing to put in here, so that when people feel that this is a burden that is going to be an incredibly expensive burden, I don't think that's going to happen.
I mean, it hasn't been happening now. I mean, that's not the way the ARB has been behaving. But I think just in the future, we said, you don't know who's going to be on it. So this is part of, we thought it would be important to have part of the guide. And there are certain historic materials that are almost impossible to enforce, like doing a modern slate roof is incredibly expensive, or modern copper roof is incredibly expensive, so.
One other thing I'll add though, for part 5, the project approval process, we did have Ed Merritt of the building department look at this, and we thanked him for doing that because we wanted to make sure that we were obviously all on the same page with what we put in the guide, and he signed off on it. He also has in here a link so that what requires a permit, so that again, the user can just click to that and will have more information at their fingertips.
And that will keep it up to date.
Yeah.
Right. There was no way to say exactly here correctly because things change, so that's a good way to do that.
The last part is the sections that didn't rise to the same level of the section that we're showing, the residential section. So landscape practices, we thought, on the educational side, we thought it was important to give people direction on
I would recommend.
Right, but we don't want to get into that any more than we wanted to get into paint colors or anything like that. So, but it's kind of interesting, and again, this is like what you said, I'm sort of interested to know what a Victorian garden is.
And people who are interested in how they can you easily direct them, and by making the direction, by giving them the arrow pointing where to find it, you're going to get more open planting because people are going to take this into consideration.
It's fascinating. I mean, if you really stop and look at some of this, and Sue did such a great job of gathering a collection of these at our library. So if you really wanted to invest the time and energy and do a little research, it's not going to be hard to do.
I like depth to
I
it.
think it's also important that the first line is that we make clear that the boards they don't approve this. That's not in their purview. It's really just for informational.
Right, and that's why it was broken out its own thing, just to try to, limit confusion there.
I love it.
And then we had
44, the ladies.
She's so happy.
Everybody was happy.
Like, what if the year where people were allowed to smile in front of them?
She used to be enormous, huh?
The same year that you were a Schleswig show. In the middle of the summer.
Yeah, exactly right.
I think lighting might have
Yeah.
lighting.
Lighting was the other category that we sort of wanted to give direction, but didn't really want to direct people to a specific.
You don't have to go out and buy these particular.
And the glossary is incredibly helpful.
There'll be a test.
There is,
Everybody study up.
there is in the glossary, there is a section on paint schemes. So if you do want to think about your historic paint, we are giving you direction, like go here, so that if you want to make sure your house is painted right.
Yes, there are no must-dos.
And I particularly love this glossary, one being on the ARB, but also being somebody who talks to architects and sometimes doesn't know what the heck they're talking about. So they spent a lot of time going through these and making sure that they were user-friendly, and it's a great resource at the end.
And relevant.
And relevant too.
It's a book on its own, because with the history of it, even if you don't have applications, fundraising. And education.
So can I pull in the Historical Society for their quick thing, and then also give you Bruce's other comment? Sarah, did you have, representing Pat Lyon, who was set this? Oh, go ahead.
Okay. As a board member, the Historical Society is in favor of this design plan. We've gone through it. Everybody that commented was favorable about it. We also like the related link to the landmark legislation. And we think that it's really gonna, just as you were discussing, it's gonna really help people understand what the goals are. It sets forth the process, educates everybody on the process. So it's really a great way to help preserve the historic character of the village. So we're in favor.
I have a couple of just written in notes I'll give to Deb about the fixing up a little addition to the history page, and a little thing they found about east and west on page 7. So they do their homework.
Yes.
And then the other part, well, maybe when we talk about the, as Mary Ann said, when Bruce Clark, who's the chair of the ZBA, gave us some of his comments, that got into an adjustment to the legislation about the appeal process. So we'll talk about that, but Bruce had another comment, which I'll just read since he's been thinking about this, and it's, I'm concerned that the design guide and recommendations and the implementing legislation will create a comprehensive limitation on what property owners, including current property owners, may do with their property. This is not the typical condominium situation where the rules are laid out for everyone before they consider buying into a development, but one in which the restrictions are being imposed after the fact on an existing community and numerous property owners. I would be pleased if property owners studied the design guide and recommendations and prepared their plans accordingly, understanding that the village cares about development or alterations that are consistent with Irvington's character. It's the prospect of enforcing this document involuntarily that gives me pause. Thank you very much. We'll lead into the, but this was Bruce only. I'm not saying that there was any other input that I know of from the ZBA member.
But I think that's been my biggest concern throughout this process. And I think, we openly discussed that, but that's not what we're going for, kind of, taking, with, kind of saying now you can't change your windows, whatever. That's why I think the board recommendation has been such a key. And to me, that hasn't, switched gears to a different level now where, the recommendation is not a recommendation, it's a must, and I think that's the key to me, is that we're not doing this, we're not telling them colors or siding or anything. It's basically saying this is what you should do. And I think our concerned about getting it out as early, again, out in front of it as early as possible, because I think a lot of people, if you go down a road a long ways, it's harder to go back. That's why we're trying to get in the beginning and saying, think about the historic piece of it. It may or may not be any more expensive, and it's, I think that it's much more of a, it's not really a carrot because we're not giving them anything, but it's not a stick either, where it's more a, we want to make sure that they're making these decisions in an informed way, and if they're not, it doesn't preclude them from doing it necessarily, right, but we're going to discourage them from doing it. Right. So
That's been our hope in terms of how we positioned it.
We can even see that in the last several years, people have become more enthusiastic about restoring their homes in the village. And I think that even some of the homes that have been compromised are going to go back to using the proper materials, et cetera, as people start, getting more excited about seeing and being part of it, which is really what we really wanted.
Yes.
Having not been on the board when the historic district was formed, but sort of watching it, I remember that there were people that lived in the district who were very concerned about it, and rightfully so. And I think Bruce, brought up some of these points. And I think when the historic district was formed, I think one of the promises was that this was not going to be something that legislated limitations on what people could do. And that's why I'm glad to hear from Deb, paint colors and more. And as Brian, I echo Brian's concerns as well, but I'm happy to hear what Deb had said, that this really is not changing anything that's already been going on and has already been happening. And again, I'm interested in what the legislation is going to read.
Yeah, I think again, we think it's an improvement and actually a little bit of a reduction of burden, because if you imagine that you have an architectural review board, and that review board was working from a certain set of criteria, but it wasn't a criteria that was always shared with the applicant. Yeah, so that's the way in which we think that this is actually could be better to be characterized as a relief. I mean, if the question is that if you don't want architectural review at all, that's a different issue. This is saying now in the historic district, your architectural review has been being clarified and being defined, which I think, a lot of the frustration and the fear of the Kafkaesque loop that people would get into has to do with what is the basis for this judgment, right? And this is trying to bring people to the same place, without being heavy-handed and saying, it has to be exactly, because, there is a different kind of historic preservation that I think sometimes people confuse this with, which is like what you do to a landmark building. Like a landmark building, preservation is very, very severe and often very, very expensive, because not what this is about. These aren't landmark buildings. There are a few landmark buildings in the district, but that's not the level of protection that's being placed here.
It's more about the character of the entire district.
I just have a quick question, though. And maybe it's because we need to get into a little bit about the implementing law. So if an applicant has a design, goes in front of the ARB is following the guidelines or using the guide as their guide, and they insist on a particular way of handling a particular situation, and the applicant doesn't want to do it for whatever reason. It may not just be money, but there may be other reasons. The ARB doesn't have to relent. They can be denied, essentially, and then the appeal goes to the Board of Trustees, who could also deny. And so I don't think that's exactly, that's not an absolute, potentially is opposed if that scenario plays out. Now, people sitting at the table are saying, no, it's not the intent, I understand it, but the language is the language, so.
So begins a slippery.
That's what has to be talked about, I think, at some point.
Well, I think it's a really important point, and one of the things to recall, I said at the very beginning, you have to know, how are they implemented? But I think a big protection in the way this was drafted was to give the appeal authority to the Board of Trustees. If it were the zoning Board of Appeals, they're limited to deciding whether the ARB's decision was arbitrary and capricious. Was there any basis for it in the record? Then there probably would be some basis for it in the record. But if the person said, but it's just ridiculously expensive, they think it's not expensive, to me it's expensive. At least and that wouldn't be wrong, the ZBA really is not supposed to take that into account, because it wouldn't have been an arbitrary and capricious decision. There would not be the same limitation. And the Board of Trustees would be essentially hearing the same case over again and weighing it. You may come out the same way, or you may not.
We were thinking also there would be examples where the ARB would behave consistently and say, like, this is important to maintain the character of this building. And there would be a situation where the Board of Trustees could look at something, actually, you know, it's more important for the village for this to happen, whether it means taking this building down, you know, doing something else. And that should be, there should be a relief valve, right? And that was why, and the ZBA can't do that. But the Board of Trustees can say, like, you know what, we want a new project on this street, and there's other reasons why we think this is important, and we're overruling what the ARB is doing here. Because the ARB is looking at a, you know, relatively narrow thing. They're looking at historic character. The Board of Trustees could be looking at economic development, could be looking at a bunch of other things that superseded the, and that would be their decision to make. And that was another reason to think of it as like a bigger relief valve than the ZBA, which would be limited to arbitrary and capricious in terms of that.
I like the legislation because I think it gives the Board of Trustees two things. One, it gives you an assurance that the ARB is actually doing what we're representing that we're doing with this guide. Because if there is an appeal, you're going to get the application yourself. You're not going to hear about it secondhand from the ZBA, but you're going to actually be presented with the application as well as the applicant who can come before you and say, this is, you know, this is too much, you can't do it, whatever. And I think that's going to be important for you to hear that directly as opposed to secondhand. I also think that the second thing that the legislation does is it gives you the ability to look outside of our record, because if it goes to the ZBA is only looking at our record, what we looked at in our overriding charge, which is the harmonious development of the village. Whereas when it goes to you, you can look outside the record. You can go look at the house, you can talk to the homeowner, you can walk up and down the street and talk to your neighbors and say, what do you think? You know, this is something that's now important to the entire village, not just to us as a board looking at one application.
So this is the main version that we have here.
Yeah, this is, it's the one I sent around yesterday. I told you the couple of changes I made to the
Look, this was in response to Bruce's question.
Yeah.
Mary Ann.
Did you want me to go through this?
Yes, it is.
Okay. The first change would be to the zoning chapter, because we now have a section of the zoning law that deals with the historic overlay district, and this would be in that section on the historic overlay district. And there's a provision now that, you know, in addition to any other requirements in the village code, no contribute. It says zoning code, but you know, actually, because the building code also kicks in, I just said village code. It says that no building can be demolished without the approval of the ARB. That it adds, in addition, any construction, reconstruction, alteration, repair, or expansion of any building in the historic district must be approved by the ARB. That's actually, if that weren't in there, it wouldn't really change anything, because any one of those things need a building permit. It has to go to the ARB, but I think it just makes it clear.
What the sequence.
Yes. Plus, it gives it, you know, makes it clear that this requirement shall not apply to repairs that don't affect the exterior of the building, nor shall it apply to repairs or replacement in kind. And right now, those things don't have to go to the ARB, and it defines a repair or replacement in kind as one in which the materials and appearances match exactly as being repaired or replaced. Then, the main amendments are actually to the ARB chapter, and this on the appeals, because this has a different appeal provision, and this was one of the changes I made in response to comments from Bruce and somebody else. Within 20 days, well, it says, this is a regular appeal to the zoning board of appeals on a regular one. It says, this paragraph shall not apply to applications for buildings in the historic overlay district, C911D, and that's where it's got the appeal provision for the historic overlay. So then 9-11 is the first two paragraphs are new, the ones in italics. In reviewing any application to reconstruct, alter, repair, or expand a contributing building in the historic overlay district, the applicant and the ARB shall be guided by the Irvington Historic District Design Guide and recommendations. And then the same paragraph for new construction and not contributing buildings. There are different, as John and Deb showed, there's different sections for not contributing buildings. And then, okay, defines contributing buildings. The rest of this stuff was all in there, already in there. It all dealt with it with the demolition. And then the other new provision is at the end, and that's the new appeals provision. And it says notwithstanding 99B, 99B being the section that says that appeals to the zoning board of appeals. Any person aggrieved by the ARB's disapproval of an application for demolition, construction, reconstruction, alteration, or repair may appeal the decision to the board of trustees by serving a written notice on the village clerk. And then any decision, board of trustees shall review the board of trustees shall review the record made before the board of ARB and may reverse, affirm, or remand the board of architectural's review decision. And then it just says, you know, if they reverse it, it remands it to the ARB.
For signature.
For signature, or also it might impose conditions or any further action. And then assume if the ARB doesn't make some subsequent conditions, those would be appealable to the board of trustees.
My only question based on this discussion is the use of the word shall be guided by the design guide and recommendations. Does that sufficiently answer Brian and Larry's concern, which I also share, that this is, we really have authority to, we're not compelled by this? It's the word guide.
Who do you mean the we? You mean the ARB or the board of trustees?
It's where it says that we,
What shall be guided by, but that's not to say that somebody couldn't come in and want to put on an asphalt roof over, you know, what was a clay roof before, and that the ARB, you can't do it, you know? They should be guided, but they still could make a decision that it would be so out of character with that house and with the historic district that we just can't approve an asphalt roof.
But at the end of the day, that
You
is.
shall be guided, but, and the language was put in a couple of places about they should take into consideration cost, but maybe they think $1,000 isn't a whole lot of money, but to this applicant it is a lot of money. So my guess is there could be decisions that the applicant, that the homeowner's not happy with. And then you guys get to see them.
The thing to remember is this is not different than the condition right now.
Yeah.
Right. You gotta remember that this isn't like we're adding ARB review to this district. We're already adding ARB review to this district, and it's already taking into historic character.
Yeah, but it's just that people know ahead of time what you're gonna look
The
at.
phrase shall be guided by.
Shall be guided by.
I think that's
Yeah.
what-
Right.
The question is that too,
Is it prescriptive almost that you have to?
is it prescriptive? That's the
Well, how
I
do you
don't know
make
whether
it?
the word guide is
I don't know.
worthy, because eventually,
Yeah,
there's a guide, but then eventually there's an ARB decision.
yeah,
And it's
Yeah,
at
right.
that point when
Yeah.
it's locked in and then the appeals process
That wording
starts.
gives the ARB more wiggle room that we don't have to follow this.
I mean,
That's what we're worried about. We don't wanna tie it all.
I mean, you really had that example before of the, you know, person who wanted to change the siding on a building. From I think from clapper to asphalt shingles or vinyl shingles or whatever. It doesn't, you know, and the ARB said no. They didn't have these guidelines. They said no because one of the things you're supposed to look at is the historic character of the area. and they refused it. It got to be pretty confusing though, because then it went up to the ZBA. The ZBA said, "What you base it on? You know, you didn't have any." I think to kind of hurry these guidelines along so that there would be not.
And you would, and that's one of the things that would have been corrected by the guidelines in place. I think the issue there is that the guy who was doing that bought all the material.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't just that he needed to do it, he needed to do it because he had bought all the material. If he knew that that was something that
He wouldn't have
would
bought
have
the
directly.
material.
That's a very good example of everybody knowing way at the beginning
I think it's a
what
really
the
good
rules of the
example
game
of when we were, I think he got all that before we were the historic. Isn't that what happened?
I mean,
I mean, that's not, it's just, I was thinking, it's something that would have been corrected, would have been.
So when there are like two different trails. If you have a home outside the historic district, you know the rules of that. You end up at the ZBA if you have, you know, but if you're in the historic district, it seems you have a pretty clear roadmap. Read this here.
Right.
And it says, you know, yes, the cost of things is considered, and yes, this is considered, and yes, this, and then you can, if you want, you can look at what the legislation is, and you say, okay, they're gonna be guided by it. Okay, I know what it is. Oh, and what happens ultimately if we disagree? Oh, I guess those 5 people that sit there, I guess, well, you know, right. How many times that happens, I bet it won't be that much, but, you know, if it is.
I think the goal is that the guidelines reduce that.
Just like I thought, maybe, like you confirmed, it could decrease the amount of conversation and time spent there if everybody is kind of prepared ahead of time.
more money and
And
spent ahead
I'm
of
gonna
time.
ask, anticipate the ARB is not gonna be like, nope, this is the letter of the law now, this is
Yeah.
still a guideline for you, so it's like, I prefer that. Live with it as approved, like, it's not gonna be like, it's not like what it says in here, you know, now you go to the
Manage
DOT.
Come with something in the middle.
Yeah, and I think the thing to keep in mind is, I mean, the charge to the ARB is to protect the historic character of the village and the harmonious development of the village. That's what we're
That's already
responsible
in
for.
place.
That's not changing. All the guide does is guide us in that charge. you
And
know.
at the same time, guide the homeowner.
Yes.
in what
And
the
the architect.
It's not just the homeowner,
Right,
it's also the
but,
architects.
but so you have a certain expectation, but now the people planning renovations, oh, they have something, and a homeowner can say to the architect, look, this is what it says.
You argue with
And
her.
I think too, when it gets to the board of trustees, the bar's gonna have to be so high that it's
Yeah.
gonna hurt the historic character,
Yeah.
that, you know, the way I look at it is, 99 times out of 100, I'm gonna say, you know, if I was on the ARB, I'd be, you know, do the best you can, but you're still okay.
Right.
But if there's something like, you know, we're gonna, you know, take down the, you know, the McVicker house, the Historical Society wants to build a McDonald's look-alike, you know. That's gonna raise the level, but, you know, like, if it's gonna be, you know, I'm insisting on putting in modern windows because my house is freezing all the time, it's not great, but it's not.
Yeah, those aren't gonna be the things that come to it, because it's not limiting. Those kind of decisions that are practical decisions aren't really gonna be limited by that. I think it's gonna be something that's, more of an outlier. The same way things that go to the zoning board should always be things that are outliers, like odd-shaped properties or something should be the same way. There's gonna be odd conditions that somebody wants to do something that would be in the interest of the village or really in the
Yeah,
interest of
where
the
there's like two
applicant.
contributing buildings and so.
Right, someone wants to do something cool, you know, you guys have to be able, I could just think, like, I'm not sure. Economic development situations where you need to have a way out, yeah, you have to have a way out to do other things that are bigger and more.
You know, the other thing that's really important is these are really worded pretty gently. So the roofing is a good example. It doesn't say, it says, use materials originally on the building or alternates with similar texture, scale, reflectance, color, and thickness. So it doesn't say replace it with the same stuff. So the substance of this, quite apart from whether you call it guidelines or rules, or
Even if it was a rule, you were saying it would be a gentle rule, even if it was.
it is.
Yeah. Instead of, you shall, get this kind of roof, that's
It
only
doesn't
this
say
kind of roofing.
replace clay with clay or slate with slate, it's,
it doesn't,
It
it
recognizes
doesn't
that.
say that you have to restore
Right.
it to, its original
Yeah,
historic.
even though that may be what you really want, but it doesn't.
Adaptive reuse, and keep in mind that it's really about the character of the overall district than it is any individual building.
So,
I did have a question for Mary Ann.
Yeah.
In terms of this, has nothing to do with the guidelines. Reading through this, and I was trying to think again. It seemed to me something was missing. So tell me, in this code as we have now, didn't we try to write something in that addressed the 130 Broadway, whatever, the Allstate
That's a
demolition?
different.
30 May.
I said it was different.
Yeah,
I'm just
right,
asking
no,
if we
I'm thinking, I think I'm remembering, but on a different piece of, a different page.
Sorry, guys, I have to run.
So, thank you.
It's urgent, I have to go to band practice for the band that's playing at this, at the.
I was just
Spring
asking
Fest,
for
is it called?
information. I'll ask you after. We had two things that seemed to be, remember the thing about the Allstate demolition was it wasn't a full demolition, but also it didn't fit any of the criteria. It wasn't a financial,
Yeah,
and I read through here trying to figure out where's the.
Well, you don't have the entire section.
Oh, that's right. I'm tricked by the.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a different section.
Okay, thank you. I got tricked by that. I didn't go back and reference the.
So I've one quick observation for me is that the board decides to move forward with this very interesting public relations exercise because I think there are, based upon some of the past history around here, there's probably a fair number of people who are very keen on some of the promises that you discussed earlier about, not being forced to do anything and all that type of thing. So, and you have perfectly valid explanations in and out of those areas, but I think it's a tricky exercise.
We call that a lively discussion.
No, whatever euphemism you want to do it. But no, it's a challenge, that's all, I'm just pointing that out.
Well, what would be the next step? Would we call for a public hearing on this, or are there changes that anybody was suggesting in what this last draft was?
See, that's the funny thing is because it doesn't seem to me that just like the guideline itself is written fairly innocuously, gently. Yeah. We already had demolition appeals coming to the board of contributing buildings. Now we're just saying that any appeal within the historic district comes to the board. So it doesn't seem like it's that significant of a change to me. I mean, I know it's significant. It's changing in different ways because an appeal, anything that was about lot configuration, setbacks and stuff like that would still go to the ZBA, right? Because it would not have been it would have been a planning board decision, not an ARB decision. So we're only seeing things that are coming from the ARB.
Exactly.
So it's not really disrupting a lot of the process, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
That's what we hope for. I think in some ways it gives the homeowner a potentially easier out because we can consider anything. We can use the common sense rules and not just.
Yeah.
Plus, we don't have to be totally quantitative about things.
Right.
To me,
I mean, it does put a lot more discretion on our board for these things. And, if we had a certain group of 5 people that work, you don't want to paint things green or blue, you could have them, they'd have to chase down on it. So.
That's right, it's nothing about color.
Nothing
about paint color.
There's collusion between the ARB and the DOT about only blue buildings going forward. And you could.
To match the signs.
But I guess
Where I see it, where it's gonna be interesting is when people already live in a home where they've used materials that we don't like, or that aren't part of the guidelines, and now they wanna redo that property. Will they go back and restore the properties to like where, and that's what I'm hoping that the guidelines are gonna do.
Well, we hope that'll inspire them to do that, but it won't be any different analysis than we're doing now, even if we didn't have the guide. We would try to
I'm
encourage
hoping
them
that
and motivate
that's
them.
where we, like, if somebody comes in with something that's, and they want to redo it, they have to rebuild their porch that was already, then maybe they will have to embrace the correct design. Do you know what I'm saying, Rob?
Yeah.
I mean, I can see how that can really improve in the village.
But I would say that if they said we didn't want to, we're putting in the new Anderson windows, I think that that's okay too. You know, like,
Right.
we'd like them to put in, you know, the historically
But
significant.
even if they put in Anderson windows, the style could
Exactly,
be.
a 2/1 as
Right.
opposed to.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, and that would be the conversation. Well, we want Anderson windows. But
Yeah.
nobody
Okay, that's
says
fine.
no.
They have to
And
have
have
the
you
same style.
considered- Do you know that you can do?
Right, exactly.
And then the other thing to add, just for those who may be watching, is we only get maybe 1 or 2 appeals a year at the ARB. I don't want anybody thinking this is a, you know, we knock back any application that's in the historic district because we're too tough. I mean, we are doing our very best to have a conversation with every applicant to make sure that we both walk away feeling that we've done our job and they've gotten what they've wanted to for their property. So I don't anticipate any more appeals happening, and it's not like you're going to be flooded with them.
Yeah, and, you know, these guidelines are kind of what we've all been trying to do anyway, you know what I mean? So it's not like it's completely new and draconian. I think it is, you know, in the spirit of what we've always talked about, so it's not a big, there's not a lot of big surprises in here.
So by the way, Mark, you're right. What happened was I put these changes, I downloaded the thing, and the code online doesn't have the most recent stuff in there. But it's just, it doesn't change anything, I just have to renumber it, but I'll incorporate. The numbering will be awesome. No.
Because I was reading a couple places, I'm going.
See, what happens
What
with the code online is
It
it
takes a while.
doesn't get integrated. So if you I usually don't download, I usually retype it, but that's just ridiculous, it was too much.
Well, let's just be sure in terms for the public hearing that we have to.
No, I have to put this into it's not in local law form anyway, but I have to put it in local law form anyway, so when I do that, I do have the right thing, I have it tucked in my book, and then I use my book instead of the online. Thank you, Becky.
How long does it take? Do they batch it up like quarterly or annually? How long does updates?
We do an electronic update every 6 months, and the book gets published once a year.
Yeah, so this was just the change was, well, the draft is dated January 31st, so my guess is it was just enacted in February and March.
Okay. So what happens if someone on there?
Well, it's online. It is. It's online, but you have to look at it. It's tricky. It's tricky, and there's nothing you can do about it.
They're not integrated.
So that'll be in June. That'll be the 6 months.
No band practice tonight? Well, you wasn't all stay for capital budget.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Well, I'll,
No, I'm just.
okay, I'll put this in the form of a local law, and when do you want to call for this public hearing? I guess is the
Yeah.
thing.
Might as well jump.
Do it.
Do we want to do leaf blowers and historic? I think we.
Yeah, have them all together.
I think we say leaf blowers first and then the historic district myself.
I think we should do both.
In the historic district, you're only allowed to use rakes.
More goods, that's right. Rakes and goods. And when you.
Yeah.
A goat with a rake.
Anyway, so.
Maybe we discussed the timing.
Okay, you decide. I'll prepare. Talk down wherever you want to
May get the larger homeowners.
Thank you, Rick.
Well, we gotta make sure that Bridge Street and Trent are paying attention to this.
Okay.
Also, will we have revised this law and the leaf blower law for Monday night? Well,
I'll have,
for when?
I'll have them tomorrow.
All right, so I'll put them on the agenda to announce. If you decide you don't want to call for the public hearing, you don't have to call for it. I'll put it on the agenda.
Ready.
Okay.
Right.
I'd rather
Okay.
shoot both days at one time and duck.
Well, whatever, they'll both be on the agenda, you can announce whichever one you want.
So in theory, when's the earliest public hearing?
June 5th.
June 5th. We can announce it next Monday, and then the next meeting is June 5th.
So the only thing I would say is that it would, PR-wise, be better not to push it closer to the summer, so it doesn't, because there were complaints about that for some.
You can always carry it over to September too, like that's.
That might be better, then we can do leaf blowers sooner, because that's more immediate. And
What was
So a summer count is June, if it's.
Oh, I think June is fine. I think July.
June 5th and then June 19th.
I mean, the end of June, up to the end of June, because we're in schools. Schools in session until June 25th, so as long as it's not after school.
I agree. That's, then we go on hiatus.
There's some people here in July.
We have one meeting each month there. Let's
Then we have our town hall started.
move it on to announce for now. And then
Okay.
I'll noodle it over the next.
The only thing I would say, being on the ARB, that if we wait till September, it puts us at a little bit of a disadvantage because we have it, we'd like to use it, people have heard about it, it's been circulated, so we may get into that kind of awkward
Why
position.
can't you just start using it anyway?
I was gonna say that to Connie after the meeting, that if it turns out that it is pushed back, is there some way we could use it, but we just don't have the legislation behind it? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, because it's just like any other, like.
Well, use it as your resource, you know, as a resource you would use.
Informational resource.
Okay,
I would.
so I'll wait to hear them.
Sorry, we've been a little late.
Thank you,
Thank you very much.
The final
Committee
draft.
is left.
This is all part of our sneaking laws by having you here for hours.
I know.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Rick.
I get to go.
Sure don't want to.
Goodbye.
Sure don't want
I get to go to the service.
You don't have to go.
I think it might have to give it a.
Oh, it's got, yeah,
I don't really have any.
Bye. Yes.
Thank you very much.
The single word game.
Play the game, the lame game of find the changes.
All right, should I move back?
Want to stretch your legs?
Thank you, Mary.
All right. Have a good weekend. Big money.
Do you need me? No. I'm telling you, thank you. Don't go home and watch the news.
Oh, God, it was
I never do.
Watergate.
There's one fresh one if anyone needs.
No, I need a stiff drink after last night.
Yeah.
Well, let's do this quick so we can go home and get one.
Yeah.
I think
You've been on a, you've been on a plane.
I've been going for a week. I got home Sunday night from Vegas at midnight, and I had a 5:35 car on Monday. I feel like I just got back from like Mozambique.
Go home and
You're
be
young.
in college.
You can handle
It's
it.
only a week, but I feel like I've been gone for months.
All right, what do you got for us? Capital budget.
Do we have an estimated time on this?
No.
How long it last?
Yeah.
No. You can't make me. Sorry.
Okay, okay.
So, we hand out,
I can distribute.
yeah, there you go. There. These are the, yeah, this is the capital budget, project listing by department. So, what I think would be helpful to do is to run through, not every single project, don't worry, but,
For every
but
year.
each,
Does it conform to?
yeah, but each department,
Guided by.
yeah, we'll run through each department, give you some highlights. I think some are hardly even worth a discussion, like the clerk and administrator department, which is really the upgrade of accounting software. That includes the water, yes, Mark, it includes the water software, finally. We're
I
zero.
didn't say anything.
But I was anticipating what you were gonna say, so. I'm just giving you a hard time. All right,
She
so.
wants to go home too.
All right, so moving on to DPW, so here's the items that we're broadly accomplishing in DPW, and that is, of course, typical equipment replacement, vehicle replacement, like a sanitation truck, which has now been, this is a 23-year-old truck, we've now pushed it off for 3 years, so we are recommending it finally. But the other work, and then you'll see that throughout the various years, we have 10 years worth of replacements here in this capital budget. But the other important work that's being looked at is a significant amount of infrastructure work. There is, we're following through with our flood control projects like Station Road, you know that. We are, looking at that sidewalk on Hudson Road West, which we've been talking with Mercy College about. And then there's paving. What we had done in recent years over paving is we typically get about 80,000 plus, or a little bit more, 90,000 from New York State for CHIPS money, which is Capital Highway Improvement Program. And what we had been doing was supplementing that with an additional appropriation of about $120,000 every other year. We then did a road study, which I know you've seen. It's on the village website. Our engineers reviewed every road, evaluated them, rated them, and then came up with a replacement schedule, which repaves every road when it's going to be necessary over a period of roughly 30 years, I think it is, in that range. And that requires an appropriation of today's dollars of $200,000 a year to stay on that schedule. So we've revised our capital budget to conform to that, which basically shows about 120,000 roughly coming from borrowing, and then the other 90 or so, it gives you a little more than 200,000 from the New York State funds. Now that we're into that recommendation of going on a yearly basis, it becomes less and less logical to borrow the same amount every single year, year after year. So what we are recommending is, over time, not starting this coming year, but in future years, if you look on page 2 of that document that I gave you, we're slowly transitioning from borrowing that necessary amount to incorporating in the operating budget. So, for example, on that page 2 at the bottom, you'll see paving, and you'll see the amount to be bonded, 90,000, even though the whole project amount is 120. The other remaining 30,000 comes from the village budget. If you're able to appropriate it.
I was going to say, that 30,000 alone could.
Yeah.
And
we'll discuss that later.
Oh, yeah.
Now, and just to show you, the following year.
Next year it's 60,000.
The following it's 60 and 120, and so on. So it weans us off essentially. So, but you get to, at the ending point, 4 years, 5 years from now, you get to the point where the entire amount is incorporated in the village budget if you're disciplined enough to do it. And then you no longer have to borrow for it, and yet you're staying on schedule with your paving, in theory.
So is that with or without fireworks?
It blew up the road.
I mean, it seems like, I'm just gonna be skeptical here. How are we gonna, seeing the trends of revenue and stuff, and knowing that the construction revenues are gonna be dropping, building department revenues are gonna be probably leveling and maybe starting to drop a bit, where is 120,000 gonna come from?
Right, but it's 30,000 a year
Increase.
over a period of 4 years. So you're not absorbing 120,000 all in one budget year.
No, but
You're
it's
stepping into it.
cumulative, right?
Yeah, but the tax cap isn't cumulative. The tax cap is only year over year.
Oh, okay.
It plays nicely with the tax cap.
I understand that, but we're asking,
So it's
someone's paying for it, residents are paying for it.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So I guess the difference is, do we save money by not having it bonded through?
Yes.
See,
Save the interest cost.
I mean, I think that's the argument that should be made.
And we've done a similar thing as when we did the every year replacement of police cars.
Perfect example.
They used to
And the
bond.
infrastructure money, there's,
Yeah.
the first line item on this budget for every DPW year is something called infrastructure maintenance. That's $130,000 that you had the foresight to put into the budget every year, so that we didn't have to come in here and say, listen, we need 20,000 to do some drainage work and a little bit for curbs here and there, and, but that's money that is there, and every year is there, and it's needed every year, and we're making the argument on the paving that the money is needed every year.
Yeah.
That's our point.
Yeah.
So, again, look.
For next year. And basically cost-effective way of doing it.
Zero going into the budget.
Right, so it's,
regularizes it.
that's the concept. I mean, we have to step into it slowly.
And we might only be able to do 15,000 next year, like potential. It's just a plan.
It's all planned.
It's all planned.
It's consistent with something that's recurring costs,
Right.
that we take it out of capital.
Right.
It's,
The bottom line is, if you buy into the argument that the paving needs to be funded at the level of $200,000 a year, then it makes little sense to borrow all that extra every single year. It just doesn't make sense, you know.
Well, what's the history of borrowing for paving? I mean, in the time I've been here.
It was infrequent, yeah.
If you go back far enough, was it just
No, we would do it, but it would be fairly infrequent.
infrequent? And
So-
then it became more
Yeah,
regular?
or even maybe 4, yeah.
Yeah.
And we had tried to be disciplined and do it every other year, which is what we
Yeah.
originally had in here, but then the study revealed what the true capital costs were over a period of the lifetime of these roads, and it was a very healthy study.
It sounds like the long-range planning effort usually pays off. I mean, you look at something, the engineers looked at the whole thing, and now you've looked at the whole thing, and you're saying, okay, if this is this and this compared to this, then this
At
is
least
what you
prevents
have
us
to
some
do.
surprise in 12
Yeah.
years, but also like, I only need $1.2 million for.
I mean,
Right.
the underlying argument, the underlying debate at this level is more about, do you want to support the paving schedule that was analyzed by our engineers? And if you do, we're recommending the right way to do it. If you're inclined to say, you know what, we'll get by, maybe every other year, still fine with us, that's okay too, you know what I mean? But the threshold decision is, are you supportive of the long-term planning that the engineers calculated? So, I mean, that may take some time if you want to look at that. It's all, like I said, it's all on the village website. So, okay, so paving is an issue, equipment we talked about, drainage work we talked about. That's essentially what makes up this budget. And what we try to do, as we always do, is try to spread things out. And to be honest with you, there's only a certain amount of infrastructure maintenance you can do in any given year. I mean, you know, it's a management thing.
So before we go off of here, I just want to say that I think it's really critical at this point. I was sending some information around. We can't just continue to buy replacement equipment as is, meaning let's go out and buy another diesel garbage truck, right? I mean, there's stuff happening now that it's either on the market, coming to the market, or whatever, and certainly in the time frame of the later years. For instance, next year there's going to be an all-electric pickup truck that could serve, like a heavy-duty pickup truck that has quite a good range, has a lot of torque, has a lot of capability, that could in fact replace, or not replace, but be the pickup trucks that we're purchasing. So I just want, and the price differential is not significant at this point.
Right.
So I just want to put that out, you know, it's my flag that I keep waving, and I know we have one electric vehicle now, but
we are,
Maybe money available to us.
yeah, there could be, yeah. We're totally in sync with that.
I know you're always looking.
Well, and you know that we've been, every time I have a conversation with a person who's an expert in electric vehicles, the first thing they tell me is, well, we can take care of your passenger vehicles, but we really don't have a solution yet for your other fleet vehicles, like garbage trucks and dump trucks and all
But
those
that's
other things.
now-
I'm not saying it's not gonna be that way forever, but it's on our radar screen, absolutely.
Well, I did
The
send
garbage truck that we're purchasing,
about
Yeah.
those heavy-duty pickup trucks that are now
Yeah.
coming out in the market. They're 2018.
right, and those are the modified Chevy Silverados. if
No,
I'm
there's
not
even
mistaken.
another one
Yeah.
that I sent an email around about that's a all-electric platform.
Right.
So, I mean, yes, they do have built-in, they're just not built off of the original gas chassis. But you got to keep your,
We're more
I guess
than
the
willing-
village has got to keep its eyes out
Yeah.
on all that.
That's
So
never
this
been
isn't
an issue
locking
with
us
us.
in for 5 years, this is
No,
a
no.
5-year projection.
Right.
So we'll be considering what's newly available on the market as they
Absolutely.
become available.
Well, there might, I mean, my concern is there might be a slight price differential, or there may not be, but it's.
Well, we'll analyze it at the time. I mean, you know, if
They
it's,
might last
if it's
longer.
astronomical and the
Not
savings aren't
necessary.
great, then we'll
Good
make
list.
one decision, you know what I mean? So we'll look at it.
I don't know what the lifetime of a pickup truck is, but it's not that long because they're being driven into the ground by plowing and everything else.
Some, certain ones, depends on
Yeah.
which vehicle, right. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of DPW, I mean, without going for every project, obviously. We did take some steps to increase some of the drainage project amounts because we recognized, as we learned from Station Road, that the engineering work that was done was very
conceptual. In fact, I think that's the word they used in the flood plan. It was conceptual, and the cost estimates that were based on conceptual design. So in actual fact, some of these projects are very complicated and much more complicated than they would have anticipated as a concept. So we have increased some of those numbers just to try to account for that. But you know, there's a constant search for grant money.
And that was my question here. Station Road sidewalk for 1819?
Yeah.
We got
What
grant
page
money.
are you on, Mark?
2.
Page 2, yeah.
Okay.
We
Bottom
did
section.
receive
850.
Yeah, that's reflected.
This 850 is the 11.
Yeah, see, the way this is structured, this sheet here is, we show you the total project amount in the right column, but the amount to be bonded is the actual part that's our debt, so.
Because we got a substantial grant for that, so.
Yeah, and that's reflected in that differential between the two. See that? Larry catches on. No. Anyway, so, but we are looking, you know, another example, I was just made aware of the consolidated funding application process. There is a small provision in there that may apply to widening of culverts, and we have Hudson View Park that is really the next complicated one on our list, and so we're going to be trying to look for that.
Maybe that's out by Sunnyside.
Yeah.
Consolidated funding, that's coming up again?
All right. So again, this goes way out to 2022, 23, 24. Fire department, which is now page 8. One of the big changes that we've made here, and I wouldn't say that it's really earth-shattering at this point, is the fire department has requested, they recognize that a move from their building is probably a ways off, both from a funding availability and from the actual, you know, plan of where to go, yeah. So they are requesting certain key elements of their building that need to be worked on, and so the two biggest ones are the windows and the roof in the first year here, and there's other.
They're not in the historic district, are they?
I don't think they're considered. Call me crazy, but 1965 is not a good year. It wasn't a vintage.
It's like old cars, you keep them running long enough, they
They
become antiques.
become classic, yeah, that's
All
right.
right, so we're not going out looking for antique windows?
No,
Okay,
no.
okay, perfect.
The other thing.
1965.
The other thing that we did, and this is, just so you're aware, this is not a change in any decision-making here. We moved the replacement of engine 178, which is, again, on page 8 here. We moved it from 1718 to 1819. The reason we did that is not because we're delaying them in any way. You hired a consultant for them to do the bid specs. The reality is, I haven't even seen a draft of the bid specs, so I'm guessing that even if they get out to bid in the next 3 months, let's say, you're not going to be paying for a fire truck before the 18-19 fiscal year, so you don't need to borrow the money a year early. So that's all that's reflective of. But the final, I guess, big thing is that we're no longer including, just for projection purposes, it's much easier to talk about this, we're no longer including the firehouse project itself. At one point, we did have about a $7.7 million placeholder in here, and it just becomes dominating in terms of the discussion.
It destroys that.
It destroys any sort of graph that we put in front of you. So, you know, that's going to be, and we'll talk about a similar project at Halsey Pond. It's going to be one of those projects where the community is going to have to deal with that as a one-off project, and you're either going to do it or not do it, and you're either going to break the cap at that point in time, whenever that is. Maybe you're not even on the board at the time when it happens, but the point is that you're
Break and jump.
you know, yeah, right, you know,
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
but you're gonna deal with that as its own entity and its own conversation. So putting it in a really pie-in-the-sky projection time frame here just messes the whole equation up here. So that's the concept.
Is that
on
something that gets as a referendum, like a special bonding referendum on the ballot?
You can always choose to handle it that way.
Oh, we don't have to.
Right, you can petition yourself to have it as a referendum, or someone in a certain number of people in the community can petition and cause it to be on a referendum.
Okay.
And many places do that, you
Yeah,
know, as you
that's
know,
what I'm
so.
thinking.
Because they know that no one votes against the firemen, so. I'm only kidding. All right. So moving on, the library, that's a minor thing. Yeah, they talked about a chiller replacement. We have what we call this multi-department kind of town hall, I guess is the main thing. We're putting as a placeholder on here the clock tower restoration, which some of you may find a bit ironic since we feel like we just did it but there are some significant things that have deteriorated. Not so much the paint, that's the easy part, but some of the underlying wood, it doesn't last as long. So there's going to need to be work done, essentially.
Signage, we have to keep it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a placeholder.
Build a plastic one.
Police is fairly straightforward. Some of the ones you see on police, for example, are when you see to be bonded zero. That simply means that we'll probably be recommending that the money come from fund balance. Some of the smaller projects we tend to do that with. Yeah, so it's, yeah, again, you can look those over. And the rest of it's mostly police car replacements. Recreation and parks, fairly small amount of projects here. Small dollar values. We do have some repairs to make at the Halsey Pond Ice House. And senior bus in a couple of years. So there's a few items on here. We have pushed out, for purposes of this projection, we have pushed out the Matheson Park renovations, which includes playground and bathrooms. We pushed that out to 1920, since again, we're not really at the point of having finalized plans, and so, that's what worked for us at this point in this budget. Theaters and other, let me jump back, I'm sorry, on recreation and parks. The one item that is not in recreation and parks is the work that will be necessary on the Halsey Pond Dam. The reason that that's not in there is because I have absolutely no idea how much it's going to be. It could be $500,000, it could be $2.5 million, I don't know yet. That will probably be handled very similarly as the firehouse might, which is you're going to have to deal with that whenever the moment arises. And so that when the analysis is done, and the DEC is done looking over our shoulders, whatever the final recommendations are, and again, I don't know what they are yet, we're going to have to deal with that, and we're going to have to deal with it head on, and you're going to have to come up with a way of funding it. And, I mean, we're here to help you, but that's going to be the, but it's impossible to project it at this point, so.
Well, these are the two big ones.
Those are the two ones that are not included in this capital budget, right?
And we don't know how much, but we know that both.
But they're big.
Yeah.
We don't know
I
how
mean,
many.
it's just.
I mean, we have an order of magnitude on the firehouse, but it's so large that we have no way of figuring out how to do it, and we don't have a place for it yet.
Well, I mean,
Other than that.
As we discussed about the firehouse, the thing that makes it viable is that we know what makes it viable, but
Yeah.
finding a location to get the DPW moved as well, and then, making some real estate revenue as well.
Right, yeah. That could make it more economically feasible, but that's a tough project.
Yep.
One other point on page, 17, the theater. We do have air conditioning in there. Again, it's more of a placeholder than anything, but you'll also notice that there's $1 million price tag in there, but I only have $300,000 to be bonded. The assumption there is that there's a combination of grants and fundraising to make that happen. I don't know that the village is in a position, you may feel differently, but I don't know that you're in the position of dropping $1 million to add air conditioning to the theater when you've got all these other infrastructure things to worry about. But that's ultimately your decision on how you handle that.
Have they tried starting a fund on that?
No, I don't.
Starting the what?
There's a
renovation.
Oh, yeah.
Renovation overall, kind of.
Yeah, the feasibility thing is going.
They're focused on the entrance right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean.
When we had some fundraising talks, it was like we could just try to roll some of that in as well, but it's very preliminary.
And the water department, which is less of an issue, there's a couple of big projects you see on here, which is the Mountain Road water line replacement. We've got
That's
that.
pretty big.
It's big, but what I will say though is there's a fair amount of money available for drinking water improvement projects and from New York State. And for that project to be done, my suggestion will be at some point that we begin the engineering work. So you may be asked to appropriate the engineering money, get some solid plans in place, and then pedal them for as many years as you need to pedal them until you get some money. That's gonna be the approach on that one. I think that's gonna be a worthwhile one to apply for, but still in all, I have it there for the full amount at this point, not knowing whether we get that.
Are those water lines, they're not, is there something special about those two places, or what makes them?
The Mountain Road water line is very prone to breakage. It's set on a lot of rock and is in need
Some
of
of which
replacement.
we did, that was the first presentation.
You're right,
It
right,
was
this is
about
tying
some
the
of
whole
that.
thing
Yeah,
together,
they're right,
yes, that
kind of.
rock. So it's that they're breaking more often, it has nothing to do with that private, Dow's Lane has a private,
Yeah, that's totally different,
That's
right.
totally different.
Yeah, Dow's Lane would be the repairs, but, I have this pushed out a number of years too, because I can't get the residents of Dow's Lane to actually agree on how they want to divide up the cost, so that means it's not gonna get done. They have their share, and then we have our part of Dow's Lane, that's what that money is, so. Okay, so now for the fun stuff.
Okay.
Can I ask you a couple of quick questions before we have fun? Because I thought we were having fun.
Yeah, more fun.
Yeah.
When you have stuff that's incidental, but is something that might be schedulable over a 5-year lifespan, but it's not necessarily electronics, I'm thinking, like the radar signs, which have a lifespan but have a certain value. They don't go into a capital budget because they're so small in relative terms? Or would you package them together into something?
It depends on the amount. We've not typically borrowed for projects that are $10,000–$15,000 because we're fortunate enough to have a healthy level of fund balance and generate on an annual basis.
Right.
We do generate some surpluses, but they can be added. You know what I mean? And
No, I'm just wondering
how we
what the
finance it.
philosophy was. So.
Yeah, I mean, how we finance them is kind of a separate question. You know what I mean? The first is to decide that you have a need for a particular size equipment purchase. And once you decide that, we'll figure out how to finance it.
Because in here I saw the computer upgrades were being thrown in.
Yeah.
But
Well,
that's
they're-
the entire.
100,000.
Yeah, it's a lot of money, so.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, I mean, so you can certainly borrow for signs. It's just when you get into the question of the dollar amount, you may not be borrowing for them, but we can put them in.
Okay, let's
I
get on
just
to the
don't
fun
know.
part.
Okay, yeah.
I just don't know if that's the best way. I'm just trying to get a sense of what's the way to approach it.
I mean, I think we took money out of contingency because it wasn't significant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we're doing the graph?
Yeah, let's talk about next year. No, not the graph yet. I think.
Okay, the graph.
Another couple?
Yes, it is, sorry.
Thank you.
Well, I guess the question is always, how will this play out with the tax cap? So,
I have enough to say it,
Maybe the next one.
Yeah, maybe another. So what this is really is a back of the napkin. It's more just to kind of get our ideas together, how they may be feasible to accomplish. And Larry will show you how this looks plotted out on a graph, but it's where the debt service, how much money will we have the next budget, taking into account the tax cap. Because of course, anything we borrow this year is reflected in the subsequent year's budget. So right now, the tax cap for newly adopted budgets, so those that go into the fall, is almost 1.40%. The max is 2%. So with inflation going up a bit, we see an increase in those cap numbers. The other component is the growth factor. Last year, the growth factor was over 1% for us, which was good. Where it's going to be for next year, we don't know. We don't know of any large construction going on. It could be through just general renovations and enhancements to homes. But we projected it conservatively or at 0.5%. Of course, we don't know. So that coupled together is almost 2%. The current levy that we're at is a little over 14 million. So our estimated allowable tax levy increase for next year would be under 300,000. That wouldn't be taken into account any rollover amounts available to us. But this is really just for discussion purposes. So we have about 300,000 available to us to comply with the tax cap. When we're looking at the subsequent year's budget, 18-19, we have a few factors that we know about. One would be salary increases that are governed pretty much by contractual agreements. Taking into account all of our groups, police, union and non-union, it's about 138,000, 140,000. Social Security is an additional amount to cover those increases of about 10,000. So it's close to 150,000 if you want to round it up. The next item, our medical premiums are very high. They're over $2 million a year. That's currently. And we've been experiencing, we don't know what the increase will be. We've been experiencing increases historically between 8-9% to 12%. It was 12% last year. So we don't know. We'll know later in the fall, but I put in 8%, even if, 8% of over a $2 million budget line is 170,000. So that is, and then retirement, I don't think we'll see much of an increase. I can't project a decrease because I don't know what the rates will be. But based on the factors that I do know, I put a 0 for now. So I am confident that just the way that the salaries are and the formula, I'm putting a 0 for now. All right, and then as Larry mentioned, this was if we wanted to include it, the new reoccurring paving to budget the 30,000 for. So all those items together would be in excess of 300,000 right now, which goes through the cap. But as this is really the back of the napkin, we haven't put in revenues,
Or capital budget.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to get to that. That's how we segue. But
Yeah,
but anyway, we just wanted to give you a picture that.
we're already over the cap.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's
Is this
Preliminarily.
wildly different from other years?
No, the last year was similar.
It was similar. Yeah.
similar, yeah.
But you do some work on the revenue side. You try to cut back areas where you can, but it's not.
It's not
we're
devastating.
No, but we're not starting off from a great spot either. So that's the only thing we can say.
I think what that surprised, well, kind of the medical premium increases. It's just hard to keep up with a 2% cap and have a 10% premium increase. Yeah.
Especially when it's 2 million and 14 million. You know what I mean? Like it's a
Yeah.
large percentage to start with.
So, all right. So with that as the backdrop, let's.
Are we having fun yet?
I am. We had lots of fun preparing these.
Color graph, ooh,
Well, just too high.
that's the first time I've
All
seen a
that toner.
color graph in 9 years.
We almost spent our whole printing budget on the historic district, but we have just enough left.
Next year you have green instead of blue.
Take care of this carefully, this.
Do not
You're not throw it away.
All right. So
You
just
don't
to,
want to give it to somebody.
just as a quick broad brush view of this, especially for those that haven't been through this necessarily or need a refresher, what we do is we take every project that's recommended or suggested in our capital budget, and we amortize the payback of the bonds over the life of the particular project, and we make an assumption on interest, and that yields a certain amount of debt service in order to pay back those projects each year. So what you end up with is a nice bite-size graph which shows you the existing debt service from the projects that have already been approved and borrowed for, and the red being the ones reflective of what we just talked about, that everything except water. So water's separate. And what's attached to this page is simply the actual figures behind that graph. But importantly, what's shown here is, I wrote in by hand just because it's easier, the amount of change of debt service, because it's the change year over year that you should be interested in, because that's what impacts your tax rate. And so the change year over year next year, if you were to agree to all the projects we just showed you, is an additional $175,000 worth of debt service. Additional. So you can see how that relates to your tax cap. I mean, it doesn't, but. And then the following year would be an additional $130,000. Following year is an additional $113,000. And the following year, 21-22, there's a large bond that comes off of our debt service schedule that's paid off. It's actually the refunded bond that we just refunded a few years ago. That comes off the schedule. So there's about, well, there's a net of $442,000 that comes off of your schedule. So what we sat back and really tried to, first of all, we can't sit here and with a straight face present you with a capital budget that says $175,000 worth of debt service next year, even though we made the argument to you that the projects that are there are all legitimate projects. I mean, I challenge you to cross off any of those and say that you're happy about doing it. You know what I mean? And we're doing the same thing. And but it occurred to us that if you have this nice benefit in 21-22 of this bond coming off the schedule, that in essence, having to constrain yourself for these next 3 years, 3+ years, seems kind of artificial, and you wouldn't put all those projects off just because you're waiting for some bond to come off the schedule. So it seems like there's another way to cushion that, and kind of, it turns into a timing difference. If you're an accountant, you know, I mean, you kind of feel what it's a timing difference. And the projects that need to be done, when they need to be done, just don't quite line up with your finances right now. I guess that's any homeowner, I suppose.
You're not holding your chest anymore.
Look like it. I don't know what I was doing. I was throwing with the argument. Yes.
Anyway.
Sorry, I wanted to do this an hour ago, but I couldn't. I'm just kidding. All right, so. All right, so. So we wanted to discuss a way, and don't try to interpret this without walking through it. Yeah, right.
Without a degree.
On your own, yeah, there you go.
Right, you have to do it on your own.
Yeah.
And
All right.
the rest of us can help.
So what we were thinking is there a way of using our substantial fund balance to cushion the blow in these next couple of years? And then, as you all know, when you use fund balance, if you use a lot of fund balance in 1 year, like let's say you decide to become very politically motivated and you want to have, or -5 or something like that, and you appropriate $500,000 next year, well, the following year you either have to appropriate it again or you've got a monstrous hole, right? So, well, in this scenario, let's walk through the worst case scenario, or the best case, whatever you want to call it. So this schedule shows those exact numbers that are handwritten on my little schedule. 2018-19, the added debt service is 175, then 130, then 113. Let's just say, as an example, we used $175,000 of fund balance in next year to wipe out the entire effect of the capital budget, okay? The following year, you would also need to wipe out, you need to use the 175 plus another 130, and the following year you need to use 113 additional.
It's a Ponzi scheme.
Right. So we like those. So that would be a total use of your fund balance over the next 3 years of almost $900,000. What that would do to your fund balance is shown below, again, just as a gauge of measure. Right now you have about $4.1 million, which is about 23.7% of your budget. To give you an idea of what that means, our fund balance unwritten policy, but we've talked about it freely over the last decade, is 10 to 15% of our budget is where we want to be. 15 to 20% is a reasonable cushion where no one would accuse you of being excessive. Above 20% is probably somewhat excessive, and we need to use it. So we should use it.
This also doesn't take into account any additional fund balance that might be generated.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. So just based upon this scheme alone,
And if we budgeted perfectly, broke even,
and everything else was even, your fund balance would drop to 18.5%. Not unhealthy, but
Who's monitoring or judging our fund balance? Is the state doing this? Or
the state
is
would.
Moody's doing this? or-
Well, yes, for both.
Yes.
Yes, and yes.
If the state came in and saw a 23+% fund balance, they probably would write it up as a comment of being excessive. If Moody's came in, they'd probably say, how come it's not 25 or 30%?
Exactly.
So it's who you're talking to, you know? But I don't.
Actually have a statutory amount.
Yeah, they can't exceed, I think, 5% or 3% or something. It's a very low number. I mean, they have it cut to the core.
Which is strange, but.
Now, so the next set of columns that are here are examples of if you used an amount of fund balance to make the budget impact not zero, but maybe $75,000. You know, to kind of cut it off at $75,000, instead of using $900,000 of total fund balance, you'd use about $450,000. And the final column is if you could absorb $100,000 of debt service in your budget, you'd only use about $300,000 worth of fund balance. But the key thing, though, is that, let's use the most extreme example, the first set of columns. By the third year, you're appropriating in your budget $418,000 worth of fund balance. That's a big number, but then the following year, that bond comes off the schedule, and you have that's to the tune of about $600,000 comes off your schedule. So you can make it up.
So we're not building a firehouse.
Well, that's why the whole firehouse thing was it screws the whole thing up. Yeah. So. Yeah, I mean, it's.
We have 10 months, right?
Do we know what fund balances are in our neighboring communities?
We did it a couple of years
We
ago.
did it a few years ago.
We've looked at analysis.
Yeah.
We're pretty high right now, and this coming year.
So we keep having these surprises that, we had a good year.
Oh, we have all this extra money from, right?
Well,
Another film,
this coming year, yeah.
another movie.
This coming year,
Yeah, she did write another book, it's about a
the
river.
settlement agreement with the Village of Elmsford kicks in, well, the carrier kicks in, that money was received but not recorded last year, so it's being recorded in this fiscal year, which was
That's
270,000, yeah.
I'm sorry, this came from Elmsford?
The settlement over the accident.
The accident.
Oh,
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. So,
So that will be reflected in this year's revenues.
Oh, I think this is
So-
pretty clever.
Did we
So we're
put that
anticipating.
in our budget or no?
no, we wouldn't put a one-time thing like that in the budget. Because again, if you put it in one year, you gotta take it out the next year. Yeah, so it's difficult to do that.
So this seems like a one-time opportunity to play this shell game. I mean, you know, there's a major drop, you can see it in the chart, there's a major drop, so.
Right.
It makes,
It's a way of matching up the timing.
Smoothing the,
Well, smoothing it, yeah, and doing the projects when they need to be done and not
Yeah.
just holding off
Yeah.
artificially until, a certain year, so.
but for what you projected, I mean, going forward, you wouldn't know which of these columns you'd want to do, or some variant of those, until we could see the real numbers coming in. Because right now, we're already, what, 70,000 or 100, not 100,000, how much over are we?
50,000.
Sorry, how much?
Oh, in terms of the tax cap?
50.
Yeah, 50,000.
Yeah, 50,000, so.
So at this point, just so I'm clear what we're doing now, you're laying out
A strategy.
a strategy.
strategy, yeah.
And we have to wait to see some more definite numbers, or we have to?
Well, the thing is, yes, we have to wait for numbers on the tax cap, but the numbers that Brenda laid out are pretty realistic. You know what I mean? It gives you the idea that you're either at or over the tax cap for next year. You're not under, okay? And that's without a capital budget. So, I mean, that's the key takeaway. Whether it's 50,000 or 70,000 or 40,000, I don't really know, but you're over. And so if you're gonna do any capital projects, I think you have to be creative about it and willing to take a little different approach, which is what this is, at least in my opinion, anyway.
The audit's almost done, right?
No, in the start, we didn't end our fiscal year yet.
And it's the end of this month, yeah.
So,
Getting excited to get the final numbers
yeah,
from last year.
So Larry, historically, since this is my first year doing this, do the numbers as they move forward get higher? Or in other words, you know, the number of plus 175 for this year, based on these numbers, and the only real numbers are the numbers for 17, 18, because everything else is estimated.
Sure.
And then as the next year comes up, is that number usually what you're estimating here for the second year? Or is it usually a higher number because we find there are more things that come up and?
Sometimes there are things that are added, but we make evaluations and reevaluations constantly, so it may be that we pulled back a dump truck from a future year into this year, but maybe we pushed off a sanitation truck for another year, you know what I mean? So
we try to keep it as close to that.
We've been trying to, yeah. The thing that changed this year, I think, anyway, is really the recommendation that some of the infrastructure work, notably paving, but also some of the drainage work, is accelerated or maintained on the existing schedule, but in the case of paving, accelerated compared to what we were originally estimating. And that's really just because of that analysis. So, I mean, can you sit back? You absolutely could sit back and say, you know what? Instead of accomplishing a drainage project, once every year, we're okay if you push those out a few extra years. You know what I mean? But
Tell the neighbors that.
well, right. I mean, but we're trying to.
And I think as a board, we've said consistently that we're making a commitment to do the infrastructure projects.
And we're reflecting that.
It's not pretty.
We're reflecting that here. So.
Also, is it, if you go over the cap, does it matter how much you go over it by? So if you're gonna blow the cap, you might
Except
as
your-
well go
yeah.
over it.
Except your voters. Yeah.
So if we put a little bit more, if we're gonna blow the cap anyway, if we put in an additional project, we have to worry about the tax rate, but it's not gonna penalize us any further.
Here's what we were trying to do, and again, this is more policy, but we're trying to react to the way you've conducted yourselves for the last 6, 7, 8 years, whatever. We're trying to make this so that you have a budget that doesn't automatically have to blow the cap just because you're doing some infrastructure work, because if it blows it this coming year, it's going to do it next year too, the year after that. I don't think that's the way you want to conduct your business, and we're trying to make it so you don't have to. The only exception to that, I think, will be the large projects that are not in this schedule, and I think that's a perfect example where you can have an extensive community conversation, especially if it's a firehouse, but also if it's the Halsey Pond thing, and it happens to be that it's $2.5 million and not just $500,000. You have a clear conversation about the importance of a project, and then you exceed the cap because of the debt service on that particular project. That's talking to the public in a very direct way and explaining it in a very direct way. That's a one-time only, so to speak. To say that you're going to adopt a budget and then expect that you're going to increase, your debt service by 175 this year, another 130 next, and each of those years you're going to be going over the cap in order to do it. It's probably not the way you've wanted to conduct yourself in the past. So, and probably don't want to do it in the future if you don't have to. So the answer is, look, if you want to do it every year and exceed the cap, that's fine. That makes things easier, I suppose. But you're in a financial position where I don't think you have to. I think you have enough cushion. I think you have enough cushion to work with it.
Fund balance, another way you go with fund balance is it's taxes we took in that we didn't need to for various reasons.
Right, yes, you got the taxes, we want you to use them on
Which is why the state doesn't want it to run too hot.
That's right.
Because you should be spending.
Yeah, forget about Moody's. They're the outlier. They want you to have 100% in your bank.
Our fund balance is so high.
Yeah,
Good.
absolutely.
They could say,
So we're doing this
tax.
for their own good.
Well, And I think it's any of those choices are very responsible. You gotta stick to them, you know, there's a certain amount of discipline that's involved, and, but.
Right, but doing this gives us a real opportunity to stay under the cap going next year.
Yeah, I think it puts you in striking distance, yeah, as opposed to blowing it out of the water completely.
What are the projects, what are the criteria for things that don't fall under a tax cap expenditure? Aren't there certain, there aren't a couple.
Not capital.
Some kind of legal.
Well, no, not capital stuff, yeah, no.
It's not capital, but there is something.
There's pension costs that exceed
2%.
a 2% increase.
It's not gonna be,
Okay.
And
Lawsuits.
and lawsuits, judgments and claims.
judgments and claims, thank you, that's
That's what
the
it's
word.
called, yeah.
Yeah,
I thought
that
maybe-
exceed 2% of your budget.
Right.
Which
Exactly. It's huge.
Yeah,
Think about that.
and given that we have,
Okay. Well, maybe it was firehouse replacements or things like
Of course they're not. And to me,
That would be exactly what
they
you'd
just said
want, yeah.
healthcare costs are
right.
about 2%.
Yeah.
no, they're not.
They're not.
They're not, but I'm saying, why not? It's because they knew that was gonna be ridiculous.
There are bills every year in Albany to chip away at the various
Yeah.
special aspects of the tax cap, like trying to exempt capital projects, or
Yeah.
trying to exempt, you know, paving-related projects, or whatever, you know, there's some special thing, you
None of
know?
them are.
And none of them ever go anywhere, because no one wants to be associated, up in Albany, no one wants to be associated with weakening it.
If you're in Albany running and saying, I'm keeping all of your property taxes in control as much as I can, it's.
Well, what if you're in favor of infrastructure and I'm supporting that? Isn't that a counter
All
argument?
all the villages and towns get together and just have the county run everything, and have money for everything.
But, yeah, and look, the argument back is that the state has,
An Ashford Avenue Bridge for everything.
the state has had a few added buckets of aid that they've given to municipalities, so there was the, you know, extreme storm, whatever fund that was, it was like CHIPS money, but it was so, instead of 90,000, we got an extra 15 or
Yeah,
20,000.
that doesn't go.
It doesn't, yeah, it doesn't.
I mean, the
Been
pothole
on the
killer.
Ashford Avenue Bridge in the last week.
I was, I mean.
The other side is now open.
Brand new, smooth
All right.
as bottom.
Kind of. It's got a little bit of a washboard.
Doesn't seem great, yeah.
It can't be any worse than it was.
Asphalt down on it, right?
So what do we have to decide tonight?
Nothing.
Well, no.
I mean, in theory, I like listening
And they absorbing all of
Right.
this.
Yeah, I mean, look, eventually what we would like to do is, if we get a nod from you that the capital budget and the items that are in it, particularly in the first year, are projects that you don't find objectionable, important, we will proceed with, you know, getting the resolutions done, getting this budget adopted, you know, and knowing that you have work to do in the spring when the operating budget comes along, because the debt that we borrow this year will be paid off in next year's budget, you know, so.
So is there any statutory requirement in terms of approving a capital budget? You know, like the deadline or anything like that?
No.
Oh, there is no.
It's whatever we want.
No, we've been trying to keep it sometime around the end of the fiscal year or the beginning of the following fiscal year, so that we can get the bond resolutions in place and get the borrowing
This
scheduled.
timing between the publications.
Right.
For
The-
Mr. Gregory.
The reality is our existing projects that are not bonded right now, we have a short-term note that we use until we go out and issue bonds. That short-term note comes due in November. So anything we do here needs to be packaged and put in, I mean, if we're gonna do it correctly, it needs to be packaged with the other short-term note and put together. I mean, that's the right way to do it, so.
So the timing is such that when that matures, they would be borrowing the new money with that money.
And I also think the sooner the better, because interest rates
Interest
are likely
rates
going
are
up,
going
so.
down.
Yeah, well, the borrowing we're gonna do in November, I mean, obviously, if it looks like something's, you know, going haywire, we could accelerate it, but we wouldn't typically do that. The other thing is.
Like anything's going anywhere, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I don't know.
Steady as she goes.
The other point of this is that if you don't adopt any bond resolutions, the departments can't start working on any of the projects, which means that we wouldn't be participating in the joint paving bid with the other villages.
That's silly.
So, you know, yeah, so, you know, now's the right time to be talking about it. Think about it, look at the list.
historically, we've kind of wrapped it up by June.
Yeah, and you get your bond resolutions done around then, so that's the right time for that.
So we should take this list here and just kind of think about, is there anything in here that we think shouldn't happen?
Yeah.
Right.
That's not time.
Yeah, if you look it over, if you have
Or if
questions.
there's another project you think is important to move it up, or.
Yeah.
But the information that you base this on came from the departments and then your
We did a little-
analysis of this.
Yeah, and we did a little shifting around,
Yeah.
not crazy
So you
stuff,
pushed
but.
some already, yeah.
But this is, that's what I was struck by, my first budget cycle last year, that this is, you do it out 5 years, so, things are sequenced now, things from the next year are moving up in the queue from where they were last year.
Right.
None of these are like, oh my God, no, we needed a truck.
Oh, yeah, no, most of these, I mean, some are brand new, but most of these have been on the radar screen. Certainly the significant ones have been on the radar screen.
And the department heads in general are aware of what's been moved up and what's been moved down?
We're gonna circle back and have those conversations. There's nothing we did that is mission critical for any of them, so, that's not an issue. The example is the fire truck. We didn't delay the fire truck, we just matched.
It's delayed itself.
Yeah, we matched the bond borrowing to.
What about this issue of the fire trucks don't really fit in that firehouse?
Well, they have to
Isn't
get
there a-
specially built.
I know,
Didn't they
so,
go through-
so are we breaking some state law or something?
Yes.
So wait, yeah.
We are breaking,
It's not, it's a NFPA
safety.
guidelines.
Yeah.
It's not,
it's not,
So you're not supposed to have gear racks behind the trucks and things like that.
and you have to have a certain amount of clearance between the trucks so people don't get pinned when the trucks are backing in. There's just no room for it.
right. I mean, such a project is so,
It'll get done. It's just that,
I know, I can't.
The thing is, it's hard to evaluate, about if any of these, like, I'm just looking at the first one, the DPW, it's really hard for me to evaluate if these are, I'm just looking at the bottom lines and seeing that except for 1819, the bottom lines are kind of evened out, pretty much. So, 1819 is kind of low and 1718 is kind of high, in terms of the average. If you're looking at the average around 77,000 or 750,000.
So,
does that mean that maybe one should be moved out of 1718?
yeah, we believe me, we looked at that, and.
I'm just trying to find a criteria.
No, listen, we look at it that way, and the problem is that the projects in DPW particularly for 1718
Yeah.
they almost, with maybe the exception of the sanitation truck, which is the only reason why that's listed at the bottom there. But it's difficult to make an argument that you can move a 23-year-old garbage truck out and have it last another year. I don't know. But the Station Road
It's
culvert.
lasted a lot of years.
Well, yeah, I know.
Wash it every.
The Station Road culvert is happening. We already signed a contract for that. The Hudson Road sidewalk, if you are gonna pull the plug on that, I quit. We're right there. We're working with 3 different entities to try to get that project done. And Mercy's ready to write a check to do their share. You know what I mean? We'd be throwing money away.
It's just stupid.
Yeah.
We can reduce garbage pickup to once a week.
But that doesn't,
But
that doesn't
say
make
that
sense on a
factory
truck.
doesn't do it.
Yeah, that's an operating budget conversation. And,
So,
and
so
the
the
paving
sanitation
is
truck is the one that you could.
only one.
And then it would balance everything out, but what does it buy you?
Again,
Actually, literally, what does it buy?
well, but if you're.
Not just a truck, but if we were to try to bring $250,000 into the 1819.
Yeah, it's $30,000 a year. It buys you $30,000 for that service. And, if you take the approach that we talked about of using fund balance, you're already cushioning the blow anyway. You know what I mean? So you really have.
So I guess that's what I'm saying. I
Yeah,
can't see
you almost
there's
haven't.
any criteria, right, to make a judgment.
Yeah, it's
So-
more if there's something that you just see like, this is ridiculous, like, what is this project?
Yeah, and like I said, in DPW, the paving, you can consult the paving study. The drainage, you can consult the flood study, which lays out.
We know that's.
I think we're all happy that we're getting this stuff done.
Right.
We'll figure out, and we're lucky that we're kind of flush in some ways, that we've had conservative revenue and budget numbers that we've exceeded every year.
We wouldn't even be having this conversation.
Right, we could. We
This
decided to
is
get
the
to it.
balance we've always been talking about being, environmentally responsible, getting what we need done for the village and trying to be balanced fiscally, and it doesn't always line up.
And I feel too, anytime you push up infrastructure, like, you know what, don't pay this year.
More expensive. See, this is the old story, you know that from your own home.
Then your
right?
cost of
Emergency that affects
Poplar
people.
Hill goes up.
Oh, yeah, floods affect
Exactly.
people.
By the way,
This is what the service, but
the paving study is the world's best report, in case you're wondering. Because anytime someone emails you or calls you about when their road's gonna be done, you just point them to the
And
report.
I remember that was a request we had, it was great.
I mean, it was good. It was a good thing to do.
Now we need a color-coded map.
Well,
all right.
you wanna pay extra, go right ahead.
Motion to adjourn, in a second?
Second.
All in favor?